that, I call the meeting of the Committee of the Whole to order. January 22nd, 2019. Look to Mr. Fark. Are there any changes, additions to the agenda?
None from administration.
Great. In which case, I'll move the agenda be approved as presented. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. We have one delegation here today, the Three Sisters Mountain Village update on public consultation. The podium is yours.
Good afternoon, Mayor Borman and members of council. My name is Jen Giesbrecht. I'm a planner with the Three Sisters planning team, and I'm here today with Michelle Gurney, our communications consultant, and Jessica Carpat, the principal of planning, the head of the Three Sisters planning project. So before we dive into the presentation, I just wanted to say that it's the second time that we're presenting to you here at COW, and it's a really exciting time in the planning process. And for me, the planning journey is really about creating great spaces that give people the opportunity to live their best lives. So I'm really pleased to be here today and talking to you about the plan that we're working on right now. We learned a lot from you the last time that we presented to council, so we've tried to frame up our conversation for you today. So to start things off, Michelle is going to give an update on the What We Heard report, and then I'll be giving you an update on the ASP.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Jen. So I'll be very brief because I know we only have 10 minutes to talk, and we've provided to you a copy of the What We Heard report. What I want to point out is what's different than what we presented last time we were here. And last time we gave you the draft report with all of the verbatim comments. We've had a few more conversations since that time, so we've included, again, all of the verbatim comments. But what we also wanted to do was code all of those comments and give you a sense of the topic areas or themes that were most important to people. And so in the report, you'll see that we've highlighted those, and they break down like this. So the first thing that was, I guess, of the most interest was affordability, then wildlife, mobility, and then commercial. And what we've provided in the report is what those topic areas cover and include in terms of the types of things people were saying. So I'm happy to take any questions on this when we move into the Q&A portion of our presentation.
Thank you.
The feedback we received during the Phase 2 engagement is important to us. We are reviewing the draft vision and principles for the ASP to make sure that they are in alignment with the priorities we heard from the community, so the items that Michelle just highlighted. Given that the vision and principles are very high level, and some of the comments that we received are more detailed, we are also exploring the interrelated components of the plan, feedback received during engagements, and the next steps for ASP policy development. Ultimately, the feedback received will help refine the vision and principles and provide some input into the ASP, more specific ASP policy details, and future planning processes. So the last time we came to the Committee of the Whole, we were asked how we decide on what input and views to consider. Ultimately, we responded that in situations where we receive feedback, we consider all different components and identify priorities with the intent of creating the right balance. We consider all input and views. So the diagram that we've shown on this slide might be a little bit hard to read, so we have brought copies of the exact same diagram to share with council if that would make it easier for you to look at. So really what this diagram is we want to show you the thought process that we use to develop the ASP. As Michelle mentioned earlier in the presentation, affordability was one of the primary themes that emerged during engagement. So we mapped out all of the considerations that influence affordability. In the diagram, we've shown what people said during engagement. So the What We Heard component basically reads, we've heard comments saying, need housing diversity in the community, Canmore is very expensive, more local housing, those types of comments. We've also looked at not only the comments that we received during engagement, but we've also listed some of the town's existing policy direction and the factors that affect affordability. So when we talk about priorities, typically our priorities are established by the current direction outlined by council through policy. If we look at this diagram a bit closer, we can see that there are a number of town policies and bylaws, as well as technical analysis, that determine factors impacting affordability. These are shown in the inner ring of the circle and include items like the cost of construction, development levies, and application fees, etc. So, as an example, the concept of mountain architecture is identified in the municipal development plan as something that is important for the vision of the overall community. This would fall under the design category, listed under the factors that would influence affordability. Specifically, the wood beams and stonework that is characteristic to mountain architecture can drive up the cost of construction and maintenance. At the end of the day, these costs get downloaded to the purchaser and the business operator in the area, which affects affordability. But ultimately, the design is a consideration that needs to be balanced with all of these other considerations that are outlined in the diagram. So this includes town requirements for employee housing and the need for a range of housing options. As you can see, there are a lot of interrelated and complex components to balance. So how does this get distilled at the ASP level? A few minutes ago, I mentioned that during the first phase of engagement, we received a lot of detail feedback that ultimately is more detailed than the vision and goals, and sometimes more detailed considerations than what we would typically make at an area structure plan phase. So you may ask yourself, well, how do you distill this type of feedback into the ASP? So the MDP gives us the strategic direction that is reflected in the ASP vision and ultimately informs the area-specific high-level policy to guide further planning stages. When we receive feedback, the first question we ask ourselves is whether we can address the feedback at the ASP level, or if the question or view is something that needs to be considered at land use, subdivision, development permit, or even building permit stages. So using the mountain architecture example again, the MDP provides direction that mountain architecture is important for the overall community vision. At the ASP level, likely the policy direction would be that future buildings in the plan area should have architecture that reflects a mountain aesthetic. The policy may go into detail about allowing for a diversity of mountain traditional and mountain modern styles, but the details around the specific building design, the materials used, the roof line, and the street rhythm are determined at the development permit stage. Also, the aesthetic is predetermined through the design guidelines currently approved within the land use bylaw. So we need to ensure that policy within the ASP does not conflict with previously approved direction, and if it does, be clear as to why a different direction is being pursued through policy. With regards to addressing comments about affordable housing in the ASP, likely there will be policies that establish the approach to affordable housing and ensuring that affordable housing is accessible by transit, accessible to services, but details around the exact number of units, siting, and what it will look like will be determined at future stages of development. Ultimately, these type of policies need to be balanced with other considerations shown in the diagram. One might see within this context how complex it is to achieve affordability policies and striking the balance between all community desires, policy requirements, and economic viability. So we wanted to show you just one example of what we're working through now. We're mapping out all of the feedback received, the themes, the ASP policies, and the tensions between the interrelationship and the potential for divergent outcomes. These clarifying documents will help us to convey our ASP direction in our next stage of engagement. While we are currently showing the balance and the considerations, ultimately when the draft ASP is developed, we hope to use these types of diagrams to convey how input was considered in the ASP. So what have we been working on now? In addition to identifying all of these interrelated components of the plan, we have also been working on the land use concept and mobility plan for Three Sisters Village. Since June, we have been working with town administration to look at the land use concept and how it relates to the vision and principles. We've also had ongoing meetings with the town's engineering department to determine a mobility network that considers all modes of transportation with an emphasis on sustainable modes like transit, cycling, and walking. So we're close to having a draft concept to share with you, and this concept will be the basis of our technical study. We're beginning to start planning for the third phase of our project, the technical analysis. This involves the work on the types of technical inputs that are submitted with the area structure plan. This would be studies like the environmental impact statement, stormwater analysis, and the Steep Creek hazard study. So these studies are based on a preliminary land use concept. So just to be cognizant of time, I was hoping to provide you with an update on some of the key features of the plan. It's not something that we're going to share with you yet because we're still waiting to have a draft that's agreed to in principle, so something that is sort of firm enough that we can base our studies on it. So we hope to bring something back next time. However, I would encourage you to ask me a question about the key features, and I would be happy to share more with you.
Leading questions? Great.
I'm almost done.
Great.
So really, our next steps are to commence this technical analysis phase based on the land use concept and exploring where the feedback received on the vision and principles can guide policy development. While we're working on these technical aspects of the ASP, we will also be working with Michelle to continue the conversation by exploring ongoing engagement opportunities and how TSMV can be part of the community dialogue. So now I'm just going to ask Michelle to come back up and give you an update on,
Great, keep going.
Okay, so she's just going to give you a quick update on our next steps in engagement, and then we'll have time for questions.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jen. I'll be super quick. So what we learned through the first phase of engagement in the fall is that we got some really good feedback on how that went from the people who came to talk to us at those sessions. And I think I said last time, we had about 200 conversations through that engagement process, and then we presented to about 150 additional people. And so what we believe is that that's a nice approach to take into phase 4. And so we would like to follow a similar format where we're out at events, talking to people, creating space for equal airtime for anybody who wants to come and talk to us about their point of view on the ASP, and that we would again move into presentations to groups who would like to have more time with us or personal conversations with anybody who asked. And so we're looking for your feedback on that approach going into phase 4. And with that, we'll open the floor to questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I have a few questions just from the written report. I'm sure other members of council do as well. Just so an idle sort of thought from when you were speaking earlier, though, and you've noted that primary theme, the top primary theme is affordability. And I'm curious if any of the conversations have sort of been along the lines of, do people ever speak about or recognize that the absence of future development has a very direct impact on affordability? I mean, that's sort of the flip side of what you're talking about. People are talking about affordability in the context of if there's development, there has to include some affordable housing options, right? But the flip side of that whole conversation is if there's zero development, affordability is dramatically affected. And is that something that people ever talk about?
That's a great question. I want to make sure I'm clear. Were people making the connection between no more development and affordable housing?
Well, affordability of existing housing, because then that's what you're left with.
Yes.
Potentially.
Okay.
Becoming far more expensive than it is now. I mean, it's just a different perspective on the affordability question.
Yeah, I'm digging into my brain now. I know we had a lot of conversations about that, and I would say I couldn't tell you how many people made that connection. I know a few people made it. Do you remember a specific conversation with anybody?
Yes.
Okay.
So I guess it's not so much a specific conversation. However, a key theme that I did hear through engagement a lot, at least my experience during engagement, is people saying you really need to build more out there to help bring the cost of housing down. Does that answer your question?
It certainly leads towards it, yeah. Thank you.
If I could just add a little bit more. I think I would say the majority of people haven't made that linkage. I would say that, there are some who, in my context, when I've gone out and had the conversations with the public, there have been people who have said, we need to see development go forward so we can have more affordability. But there are those who may have a different context, maybe they already have a housing situation here in Canmore, or that they don't see the interrelationship of that, and their concerns are not necessarily more development, their concerns are livability. And so the priority to different people really depends on their own personal context often. And that was my experience. It may be the experience of other people on the team as well, or maybe even your own personal experience when you talk to people in the community.
Great, thank you. On the page 3 of your what we heard report, the very bottom right above the chart, the third bullet point, so there's a long list of general statements unrelated to the primary themes, one of which was tax implications. Can you just flesh that out a little bit? What were people, what did they have in mind when they flagged tax implications as consideration?
I think there's probably a few topics where people raise tax implications around that. I would say those largely were attributed to undermining costs and who would be covering costs of undermining related to what would be the tax implications of that. That's what pops up for me. Is there anything? Commercial as well. Yeah, and some of the commercial, in what context?
Adding to the commercial tax.
Yeah, yeah, that's one as well.
Okay, yeah, that computes. So a similar sort of question I have from page 5 when you're talking about the comments you've received on wildlife, and preponderance of which was addressing the need to have viable wildlife corridors, which we all understand. And a much smaller percentage, 15%, spoke about the education regarding human use in wildlife corridors, so only 8 comments. So do you think people are clearly linking, when they talk about science-based corridors, clearly linking that at the end of the day, it still comes down to the humans to stay out of the corridors? I mean, there's ultimately no benefit to design and put in place a science-based corridor if we're not going to respect that. And do you pick up on any of those sorts of comments? I mean, is that a very common theme, or is it not a common theme?
It's another good question. Again, when you ask me about common themes, I always go to the numbers. And so if I can't say in that sample group there's a statistically significant number, I can't generalize on that. But what I can tell you is there are definitely people who do not make the connection between humans using the corridor and preserving the corridor. And therefore, there are other people who raise that it's important to raise the level of education around what maintaining a corridor actually means for people. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it's just, flag something we got to keep working on more aggressively when it comes to communication and the work the town's doing. Councillor Comfort, do you have a question?
Yes, I was just curious about the mountain design component. And I know lately on SDAB, over the last year, it's a question that's kind of come up. And it seems to me that those guidelines used to be a lot more strict, and now they seem to be being relaxed. So it could be called a kind of a modern take on, or trim rather than, you can save a lot of money. That's a very expensive way to design. Very beautiful, but very expensive. So is that going to be a theme going forward for Three Sisters, or to look for alternatives to the kinds of design that are very strict? And I mean that you have, it's pretty, but it's very expensive.
Thank you for your question. I think you raise a really important point. I think in the context of the discussion we're having now, I think the point that we were really trying to make is that a lot of the decisions and the priorities that we identify are established by directions such as the design guidelines. And so when we are thinking about how we're weighing the different components of the plan, if there's approved policy that says that we need to be going in a certain direction, that's probably going to have more weight. So I guess to answer your question, this is certainly something that Three Sisters is looking at and aware of, but at the end of the day, we'll be pursuing the policy as been approved by council.
Thank you.
Councillor Seeley.
Thank you, Your Worship. Ms. Giesbrecht, I'm just wondering if there's any key features you want to share with us.
Thank you so much for your question. I'm so glad you asked it. So So we're really excited about the land use concept that we've been working on for Three Sisters Village. Again, I'm really going to be excited to share it with you, hopefully next time we come to give you an update to COW. But in the meantime, some of the key features that we're looking at would include a mixed-use core district with a central plaza, a business innovation district. So this is something that we envision could potentially have opportunities for medical offices, other types of services, maybe an educational campus of some kind, or even incubator space for starting out tech startups. So we'd be looking at that sort of development in the innovation district, and then also a boutique hotel and spa district, residential and recreation areas, and then all of this would be connected by a multimodal transportation network. And as I mentioned in my presentation, the focus and the emphasis for us is really making sure that the transportation network is emphasizing those more sustainable modes like transit, walking, cycling, et cetera.
Fantastic. I'm so happy I asked the question.
Thank you.
Was there a bribe involved? Chocolate bar or something?
Maybe.
Councillor McCallum?
Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you for your presentation thus far. So I just wanted to go back to some of the things you'd been saying about the key sort of drivers with regards to affordability. And I noted that you had brought up to Councillor Comfort that the increased community design standards sort of affect the affordability of units. Did you hear or have any conversations, or was there a line being linked at all from your engagement that perhaps the layout and the finishings of the units actually also affect affordability, and that the size of the home as well as the density of these homes and neighborhoods would also deeply affect affordability? Because we all know that with density, well, we don't all know that density equals affordability, but if the finishings are so high-end, it doesn't really matter.
Do you want to speak to that? Do you want to speak to that?
I'll follow up. You start.
Okay. We definitely heard input on mixed property types, that they're needed.
I saw that.
Okay, so
yeah.
that's there. In terms of internal finishes, I don't recall a personal conversation on that. I'm looking at Bruce, who's nodding no. So one of the planners may have had a specific conversation on that.
So I've had some conversations in the community with regards to the fact that, you know, finishings and other things are also housing choice. The culture of, you know, thinking that single-family development will be affordable in Canmore has gone by the wayside. So I certainly have had those conversations in the community, really good conversations about how to structure even internal finishing so that people can upgrade on their own as they move forward. There have been those kinds of conversations going on, but how that is addressed at ASP is really at a high-level perspective. But there are some people who understand the connection between you know, options that may be available in other communities is not going to be as readily available to be affordable within Canmore, so nestled in such a desired mountain environment.
Yeah. Sometimes it's about having conversations about the housing we need as opposed to the housing we want.
Yeah, it's a tough cultural conversation, a cultural shift.
I think it's a national culture shift because I think every community across the country is dealing with the same thing.
Absolutely.
We're just used to having a single-family home, and it's not the future. Anyways, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Just along the same lines of thought, which I was also considering, is so when we think about an area structure plan, it's a high-level plan and not that detailed. How would you imagine putting something in the ASP that would reflect that direction that Councillor McCallum is suggesting, so that within the ASP there's something that leads to future development that's designed around you know, to help reduce the market value? Question mark?
I mean, okay. So, through the chair, not necessarily, I can't come up with the wording today, but there have been some ways in which we've crafted some policy within the existing Smith Creek area structure plan application that could look at even putting that within the resort center. So there were some, I guess, some criteria that looked at the level, you know, how to make entry-level units a little bit more market affordable. There are some things you can do where you provide direction to a planner when evaluating future development permit applications that, you know, look for these types of features, or in order to provide a diversity of housing at various income levels. And so it would be quite high level at this point.
Yeah, I know it's difficult to get into an ESP, the kind of direction I'm thinking. But you know, years ago when the town initiated the entry-level housing as a requirement, it sounded like a good idea. If it's less than 1,000 square feet, it's going to be affordable. Well, they were being designed and built to a much higher standard, so you know, you were getting 1,000 square foot condos selling for 800,000. So that doesn't work. We've learned that. And there may not be an answer for this particular line of question, but something I'm interested in.
Yeah, if I may, it may not work in its present form, and maybe it just requires a little bit more refinement and thinking about how to approach it. And so maybe it's a combination of tweaks and some testing. So could be pilot or other things that we try to just put our minds together to find some sort of solution.
Super, thanks. Councillor Stanford.
Thank you, Worship. Thank you for your presentations. Along those lines, there was a comment in the affordability section relating to market-driven pricing. Can you perhaps elaborate on that a little bit, what that might mean?
It's actually in the comment. You mean in the comments?
It's in the comments,
verbatim
yeah. It's under affordability.
Yeah, so it's just generic comment asking for market-driven pricing. So I think the question is, what does that mean to us?
Yes.
That's a good question.
What does it mean? Did somebody have a conversation with somebody about that?
Yes, if it's in the verbatim comments, it means somebody said you
Raise
need
that.
to consider market-driven pricing. That's.
I believe that meant that the market is driving pricing, you know, to levels that are unaffordable to some. And how are we going to manage that within the area structure plan is something that they'd like us to or to consider. How we do that, there are a number of forces at play. We can't change the market or the desirability of Canmore. There are certain things in place here that, you know, we have to work within the tools of the area structure plan, the Municipal Government Act, the existing policy direction, and put our creative heads together as to how do we do this. And we have to strike a balance.
And have you tried some other mechanisms like giving opportunities to Canmore residents to buy properties first? I mean, there have been some of those initiatives, and is that something that might be considered?
Yeah, we currently do that. We have a policy within the entry-level housing where we make available the entry-level units for 45 days advertised to Bow Valley residents only. We've done this, normally they're 1 and 2 bedroom units because the entry-level housing policy has a maximum limit of 1,000 square feet on those units. It's done you know, in all cases, you know, the mayor has pointed out that sometimes it's not as affordable as the town would like. They are often in, you know, they have been in the past in the 4s or the 5s, the low 5s, depending on where the market is and how the unit is outfitted. A focus of late has been to, at development permit, look at low maintenance aspects of the development and not providing as many amenities within the development structure so that the maintenance, the ongoing maintenance fees are also quite low. So using structures like the Bearland condo and keeping maintenance to the exterior only, and to have materials that are mountain-like but not as difficult to maintain. So they're not going, you know, 16 or 25 feet up to, stain a piece of wood every year. Maybe we're using longboard or architectural panel or other materials to make it more affordable.
So you have some strategies that you can explore.
Yes.
Thank you.
See no further questions from members of council. Thanks for being here today with the update. Do you know roughly when you plan to be back for another update to committee of the whole?
We're coming back in March.
March. Well, have a nice time. I'll miss you. I won't be here, but that's okay. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you.
Then I'll look to the minutes of the committee of the whole for Tuesday, December 11th. Are there any errors or omissions? Seeing none, move the minutes be adopted as presented. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. Moving on to item D1, the Mountain Creek Hazard Mitigation Program update. Got the whole crew. Mr. Fark, do you have any idea what happened to Mr. Asarte's head?
I believe he requested another engineer to cut his hair, and that was the result.
Just Mike's giving me a hard time for my hair.
If you don't get it cut, it never looks like that.
He hasn't got his hair.
Okay, Mr. Asarte.
Good afternoon, Mayor and Council. We're here today to present updates on the Steep Creek Hazard Mitigation Program. I have with me today Felix Camure and Joel Packus. Felix is our project manager for Steep Creek Hazard Projects, and Joel is the engineering intern. So first up, they'll be presenting a number of updates and talking about the overall program, as well as providing an in-depth update on Cougar Creek. And after the break, we have BGC, our consultant that supported us with hazard and risk assessments for a number of creeks through the community. They're scheduled to speak about the remaining studies for our creeks with development, so the creeks above Peaks of Grassy and the Echo Canyon Creek above the horse stables out by Highway 1A. And so they'll be providing a presentation, and I mention that now because their presentation will be a bit more technical, and it's going to include an overview of Steep Creek processes at a very high level for new councillors, and as a bit of a refresher on those processes. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Camure to speak to the Steep Creek program updates.
Thank you. Thank you, Andy, and good afternoon, the Mayor and Council. So Andy has done pretty much my first 10 slides, so that's perfect. I'll just keep going then. So what I'll be talking about this afternoon is, just a little bit of a program overview, where we're at in the program, Mountain Creek Hazard Mitigation. Look at, sounds like there's a desire to actually look at the grants, the different funding sources we've been receiving for to fund the our different mitigation and studies we've been undertaking. We'll look quickly at Echo Canyon and XYZ, which is what BGC will present later. We'll also provide a very quick update on Stone Creek, a little bit longer one on Stoneworks, and show what we've done at Three Sisters Creek this past summer. And then we'll finish with Cougar Creek long-term mitigation, which is the main focus of this presentation. So I'll be using this fan boundary map to actually show the location of each creek, just to be sure we're all on the same page when we're talking about the few different creeks. So basically, the Mountain Creek Hazard Mitigation Program was initiated in 2013, right after the floods. And we've been working with consultants to actually analyze the hazard and risk assessments associated with our mountain creeks in town. The work that we've been doing involves looking at hazard and risk assessment for all our priority creeks, which what we're showing here is that those ones have been completed now with finalization of ECHO and XYZ a few months ago. And part of the work too is also we've done option analysis on proposed mitigation for several different creeks in town. And we've also worked on detailed design on some of those mitigation and looked at permitting for some of those creeks too. And we've already also constructed several mitigation projects on some of those creeks in town.
It's nice to see that chart with so much green on it. I remember variations going back over the years where green being completed. It's hard to believe we've been sitting here listening to these reports for 6 years, just about.
I was going to say it's been 6 years,
yeah,
almost. And you know, the chart actually has been modified again this morning. Andy and I were talking, and we've changed a few things based on our discussions and where we think we're at in the program. Yeah.
Great.
So in terms of something else we don't talk as much, but it's we've done a lot of work on passive mitigation with work that was done in the last 3-4 years also. One of it is adoption of policy and laws regarding Steep Creek in town. So one of them has been the MDP and the Steep Creek Hazard and Risk Policy that was adopted in 2016. And then right now, as you know, we're in the process of looking at a land use bylaw amendment or update, or well, I guess a new one.
New one. It's not an update, it's a new one.
It's a new one, correct, new one. And also we've been working on our updates through the engineering design guidelines related to steep creeks. And we're pretty close to having a final version of that hopefully we'll be presenting fairly soon. Something else we've been working on is emergency preparedness and or response plans for the different creeks, and we've shown some of those in the past. And anytime we have new information, they're being updated, so we'll do an update this year on specifically Echo Canyon and XYZ area based on the new information that we have. Also, as part of passive mitigation, as you know, we've installed 2 weather stations, one at Cougar Creek in the Cougar Creek watershed, and one here on the Civic Center. And they've been online for about 2 years now. We collect the data on our hourly basis. It goes to a global database, and it's quite easy for us to share that information. Right now, University of Saskatchewan, their cold water lab is actually getting the data live. Same thing with Alberta Environment Parks, the river forecasting team. They get the data, and it's actually posted on the website too. So anybody can actually have access to information through that portal that they have. And yeah, right now the maintenance cost is about $2,500 a year on those stations. It's mostly related to Cougar Creek. We have to fly up there to go maintain the precipitation gauge twice a year. And we collect information such as wind, precipitation, the rate, but also total accumulation, relative humidity, and we'll also look at amount of snow, rain falling, and accumulation of snow on the ground at the Cougar Creek watershed. We're going to go to the grants overview. So it's a little bit smaller here. There's lots of information. So the first one that we've been working with is DRP. That's the first type of grant where we usually get.
Can I just interrupt with a question from Councillor Comfort?
Yeah. The previous slide, I had a question about the weather stations.
Sure.
Will you be reporting on the data and extrapolating forward, perhaps, what you can extrapolate from the data? What predict what might happen?
Yeah, I mean, it's part of what we use when we do our what we call it, our high water monitoring. I can't remember exactly the title we're using right now, but yeah, we're definitely using the data to incorporate in our kind of homemade forecast to some extent. And the intent too would be to look at somewhat a little bit more automated way to actually get a better Steep Creek forecasting tool out of that too.
And are there other parts of that tool, that forecasting tool, besides this other weather stations?
Well, a lot of the modeling that's been done on the creeks need to be incorporated, like, you know, if the water, if we have rain in the watershed, how long does it take to get out at the bottom, what's the concentration, things like that. So the modeling that's been done is definitely quite key, and also weather forecasting is important. So yeah, we've had some interesting discussions with the province on that, and with consultants too, on how that could be achieved, but we don't have a plan right now, or a good plan for that right now at this point.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So the DRP program, that's how we actually were getting money pretty much right after the event in 2013. That's a federal and provincial government funding program. It's actually administered through Municipal Affairs in Alberta here. And we receive DRP money for, well, pretty much every single creek in town, plus helping out with when we're having supplemental staff coming in and all kind of things like that. The other one that was established right after the 2013 event was also the FREC program, which is the Flood Recovery and Erosion Control program. And it provided funding to address the need for immediate repairs and address erosion damage after the 2013 event. This one is a provincial grant, and it's actually administered by Alberta Environment Parks. Another one is ACRP, which is the Alberta Community Resilience Program. It supports the development of long-term resilience to flood and drought events. It's also administered by AEP, and yeah, provincial program. Another one that we're dealing with is the NBCF, which is the New Building Canada Fund. This one is a federal fund that supports projects of national, regional, and local significance. And it's administered by Infrastructure Canada, and this one is very specific to Cougar Creek. The other ones have been available for...
That last fund you just mentioned, I can't remember hearing much about it, so how do we tie in the work on Cougar Creek with economic growth and job creation, et cetera?
It's a good question. It's too bad we don't have anybody from Infrastructure Canada here, but that's the one we got. What was the date on that one? Remember? 2017.
14 million?
Yeah, correct.
Oh, that was through that.
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah.
14.3, I think.
Yeah, and this one was definitely, the province was actually working with us quite a bit to actually get the grant, so we didn't apply for it. We provided information and data for the province to actually apply, I guess, on our behalf for that grant. Yeah. I guess it is local significance, though. So.
Yeah, it is local significance.
Yeah, regional too.
Promoting economic remote. Doesn't matter. We got the money. Let's go.
Yeah, get the money. Let's go forward. Another one is the NDMP, which is the National Disaster Mitigation Program. This one is also a federal program that's administered by Public Safety Canada, and it's basically designed to look after rising flood risks and cost, and then builds, as they say, builds a foundation for mitigation investments that could reduce or even negate the effects of flood events. And this one has been quite a bit less significant for us over the years. However, this is the main funding source for ECHO and XYZ that we undertook last year.
So at this point, there really isn't very much work that's been done on Bow River, and it's still provincial work. So there's no connection between any of those grants and future work on the Bow?
So we did, there was a project done in 2016 through NDMP also on the Bow River to look at risk, economic risk through the Bow River, and then our understanding is that the province wants to do an update based on the, hopefully, the new study that they've been doing on the Bow River in terms of hazard and risk assessment, and they want to update that risk assessment that was done in CAMOR on the Bow River through that project too, through that funding source. Yeah.
Thanks. And just the last thought on that slide, so the DRP, the clock's just about run out on funding for Canmore through the DRP. But the other grants don't have an expiry date yet?
Correct. Like, so pretty much all our grants, we do have like a, you know, when we sign the agreement, there's a timeline on it. So December 2019, for example, but most of the grants we've been able to extend the date. DRP, usually it's 5 years. Canmore and several other municipalities, sounds like, got an extension of a year. So DRP funding is actually, technically speaking, expiring in June 2019.
And does the FREC grant have any kind of expiry date?
Not really, no.
Okay.
No, so the FREC, you know, we just actually signed an extension of the agreement to 2022, I believe, from that one. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Same thing with ACRP, we just extended that one too. Yeah. Okay. So now, quickly on XYZ and ECHO, I'm sure they will show you a lot more than I'm going to show you right now, but XYZ are the three kind of watersheds right above Peaks of Grassy. Echo Canyon is actually the one just by the Alpine Club of Canada and the Bow Valley Riding Association on the other side of the valley there. So the hazard and risk assessment were undertaken last year in 2018 by BGC. And again, the NDMP funds was the main funding source for this one. Yeah, BGC will be presenting pretty much everything on that. Next steps for us after BGC is presenting this afternoon is we'll be doing an update to the community about existing risks up there. We're going to start right away later today at the open house. We'll have another presentation by BGC, and also we'll be there to answer questions on that and with combined hazard maps, as we've been showing for other creeks. There's going to be also an update on the land use bylaw at some point. We're hoping to bring that to second reading for the land use bylaw in terms of right now XYZ and ECHO are Steep Creek study areas, but we're hoping to basically transfer that into hazard zones instead and remove the Steep Creek study areas for second reading. And then something else we need to do is also consider further mitigation, potential mitigation on those creeks based on our existing priorities and looking at where it would fit in our program right now. Stone Creek. So Stone Creek is the little creek just by the Silvertip development on the north side of the highway there. And short-term mitigation has been in place since 2014. That was one of the first creek that we went up and did some work up there. The work consisted mostly of reshaping the channel and building up the berm on the left side of the creek. So that's looking basically from the access road there upstream, and placing several large boulders up there on that bank to actually protect it and prevent.
That was the creek that filled up the pinnacles with gravel, right?
Correct.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
So that new berm was put in place pretty quickly.
Yeah. Yeah, that was one of the first ones to be completed, actually. And one of the things about this creek is it's sediment limited up there. It's one of those that doesn't have unlimited supply of sediment that could actually come down. For example, like Kruger Creek is one of those that there's so much up there, but not this one. So it does gives us a little bit of time to actually plan and look at what we're going to do next up there. The long-term mitigation plan was actually analyzed in 2016. We've had a lot of discussions and stakeholder engagements on that one. And currently, it is planned to be, it is in our capital plan, 2025 placeholder in there for long-term mitigation to be built on Stone Creek. And most likely we'll need some external source of funding for that one, most likely ACRP.
And much of the creek, the impact is on Stone Creek properties?
Correct.
I'm trying to recall, was there much impact below Stone Creek from below the Silvertip area from Stone Creek? No.
No.
So it was mostly, well, it was all Stoneworks Creek then.
Correct.
So this creek, there's still a municipal component in the long-term mitigation?
So, yeah, I don't know exactly what it's going to look like, but because of existing development, as per kind of our policy, is we are looking at protecting existing development. However, we know that Stone Creek properties will most likely want to develop the other side of the fen. So there's going to be there's already been some discussion. There's will be more discussion in terms of what that could look like and what portion of the western fen could be used as inundation area and things like that, and come up with a proper mitigation scheme for the proposed use up there too.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Now on to Stoneworks Creek. So Stoneworks Creek is actually a little bit further west of Stone Creek, and that's the one that's located by Crosby Ranch, just up there. So Stoneworks Creek, it's one of those creeks that actually produces a lot of nuisance flooding. We've been dealing with that one for several years. Last year, the year before again. Right now it's in unmitigated state, pretty much. It's been, very minimal work has been done since the 2013 flood. And yeah, we've been looking at obviously different options for this one too. Back in 2012, the town had just finished a mitigation program there to actually, it was a diversion berm that was built to actually send the water, if you look at this photo here, like down the, kind of straight down, which is the western side of the fan, instead of where it wants to go sometimes on eastern side, which is the right side there on the photo. And that berm actually failed through the event in 2013 and created a lot of issues downtown, including the hospital and pretty much everything that was around Bow Valley Trail that got flooded was from Stoneworks, and also the Palliser buildings there. So again, only minor cleanup has been completed on this creek. We haven't reestablished basically the diversion at this point. So what we've looked at is well, this is interesting. Okay, there you go. So the hazard and risk assessments were completed in 2016, and in 2017 we started looking at what we call the phase 1 long-term mitigation, which is actually to protect existing development. So we work with a consultant to actually design that mitigation, and it was completed. However, and we also applied for ACRP funding at the end of 2017 to receive funding in 2018 to be able to build this thing and combine the ACRP fund with the DRP fund that's remaining that we still have available for this creek. Unfortunately, the project was not selected for funding in 2018, which kind of put us in a little bit of a situation. Okay, now what do we do? How do we deal with this creek? We do have DRP money available. However, as we talked about already, it's technically speaking going to expire in June of 2019. So we only have a few months left to actually use the money. So
just before we go on, so yep. This time, I know it's early stage, but what sort of cost factor are you imagining to completely mitigate Stoneworks Creek? Is there any
total cost estimate? I can't remember the exact number, but we're talking like in the 4 million range.
Okay.
Yeah.
And your report notes that the option, the preferred option is to divert the channel back to the west and create a small sediment basin there.
Mm-hmm.
So given that the creek wanted to evolve to the east, how is it that you, so a diversion channel, is that, describe the diversion channel to me.
Well, yeah, so this is a little bit what we're looking at. So Compared to the previous image, now this thing is tilted, so the channel is going straight south or straight down is actually now going left. And do I have a pointer here? Use the mouse. Fair enough. So the previous berm was actually pretty much starting from here all the way here and stopped somewhere there, I believe.
And that's the one that failed.
That's the one that failed, correct. And then the lower channel, that this section here was actually also designed at the same time, and we had some culverts, and this is a road that goes up to Crosby Ranch right here. So there's culverts going under the road and things like that. And the failure actually, one of the failure happened right here, and water went straight towards Palliser Road. And the other one, the main failure was actually right here, and that's where the water went down towards Palliser and the town. So, so what we're looking at is to redivert the water at the same place where it was going in, or planning to in 2012. The sediment basin we're talking about is this area here, and it's really the concept of that is when you have, instead of having the creek keep going at a same grade, you actually flatten that by digging down. You slow down the water quite a bit, and it deposits like all the bigger material.
Sorry, where did you say the sediment basin would be?
It'd be basically this area here.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
that's the current channel.
Right.
That comes from up there, and we need to clean that up and dig it down a little bit.
And the basin effectively slows the water down and allows it to drop a lot of the sediment there, and then the remaining water just moves off to the west there.
Correct. So basically, from this point down, it's not pure clear water flood, but it's more akin to that than a debris flood or a debris flow would actually transport.
And this is presumably a more robust approach than what we'd put in place in 2012?
Yeah. Yeah, so the concepts are very similar. Obviously, the hydrology has been updated. The modeling has been updated, and we show more water than we thought we could get before. So the basin and the lower channel here have been greatly updated in terms of how they're being built, and now they're full of a lot more what we do a lot more in our creeks, which is the stone pitching in concrete, and quite robust with really big rocks in there.
In a design like that, would the southeast rim of the pond also be built up? Would there be berm around that area?
Yeah, so basically the sediment basin here is actually dug down. So it's lower in the ground than the existing ground right now. And then the side, especially this side, is armored. That side doesn't need to be armored really, because that's basically the mountain side here to some extent. But we do need to have a berm to protect from water wanting to go towards the Crosby Ranch instead of going down the channel. And same thing here, the existing berm that was built in 2012 would be reinforced too, which would provide a continuous protection down to the channel, lower channel.
So with that protection in place, then the future development of those lands to the southeast would be manageable.
This design here is actually to protect existing development. So
there's more work that have to be done to develop Palliser lands?
Correct. Yes. So we looked at it as a two-phase approach. So phase one is to protect existing, but knowing that there would be a chance that we would most likely need to actually look at it in terms of new development also. It's been designed so we can actually beef it up even more for future development if there's any development going down those lands.
And this design would allow for future beefing up?
Correct.
What's that little rectangular piece that comes down below the sediment pond?
So this is a kind of a working platform. You do need to maintain this and empty it once in a while. So when there's too much sediment, so it's basically showing a road that comes up from the main access road to the ranch, goes up to the platform, and then you can actually go in and dig it out.
Thank you.
And the red line here is actually the town of Canmore owned parcel. So it shows that we're using a big chunk of it to actually build that mitigation there.
And that's the old Boychuk lease land?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. The fire training ground is up here right now. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a steal when we bought that for $1.5 million.
Yeah. Exactly. And the lands below here are actually privately owned, and this is all wildland park here.
Right.
This section. So basically, right now what we're looking at is we're working with a consultant, working with the province regulators, and trying to figure out, can we actually build a scaled down version of this right away, so that we can actually, we won't lose that DRP money. We're exploring either trying to extend that DRP money further in the year, and at the same time we're looking at, can we build like a scaled down version of this project that would use the same footprint, that when we have the money, ACRP money, we can actually build on top of it again. So try to minimize rework on the different stages. Mm-hmm. We've reapplied for ACRP, and again, that's going to come out in the spring. If we'll understand at that point if we do have more funding for it. Okay. Now on to Three Sisters Creek. Three Sisters Creek is, I think I don't really have to tell you where it is, but Three Sisters Creek, there's been several phased approach to. The first work that was done was focused on the upper area, which is basically from the fan apex where the water comes out of the mountains really, down to where there's the, I don't know if it rings a bell, but the Altalink Bridge. There's a service road down there. So that's really the focus of that work that was done. It was completed in 2014 also, that work, and consisted mostly of regrading the channel, removing the sediment from the golf course pond that was there, and a lot of work around the outlet of that pond and the bridge abutments to ensure that there's good stability there. However, there's still some work that needs to be done to actually protect existing development up there. So there were some, through the long-term mitigation option analysis, there were some potential berms that were looked at a few years back. And right now we're actually, in light of the work that Three Sisters is doing up there to redevelop the land on the west side of the fan, we're working with them to actually really look at a global mitigation scheme up there, including understanding better what they want to do on the west side of the fan, how it affects our land by the existing development. If we put a berm, where's the water going to go? Will this affect their proposed development? So we're working with them actually on that to come back with an updated mitigation plan in the somewhat near future, I guess, on the long-term mitigation that needs to happen on the upper section of Three Sisters Creek.
So in a project like that, just out of curiosity, why wouldn't you build a berm all the way down rather than just what looks like little wincy ones there up the creek?
Well, there's a question of cost for sure, the question of wildlife movement. There's a lot of things like who's the owner of the land too up there, but what it's showing here like is what's going on at Three Sisters Creek is there's obviously that's the creek going to north here, but there's also the creek once it jumps its bank, like it fairly localized to some extent, but it's pretty much all modeling runs actually showed it's right here. It wants to go towards existing development. So would it be really the best approach just to cut it off there, send it back in the creek? What happens further downstream now when you do that? So those are all things that we need to figure out,
I guess that's what I'm curious about. So if those berms or one of those yellow berms up the creek were built, what would stop the creek from avulsing further down and just plowing over there anyways.
Yeah, and then it's you know, it's something that we haven't fully studied. We need to look at globally what it looks like, look at different options, and then rerun models to ensure that what's being proposed is actually going to work as we want it to work, so we don't transfer risk to our owners and stakeholders there.
Okay.
We'll come back to that one at some point.
Okay.
I don't know, hopefully this year, but yeah.
Great, thanks.
And then some of the work, this is really focusing now on the lower section, which is really from the pedestrian bridge or the multi-use pathway there down to the outlet of the culvert of the parkway. And that work really focused on protecting the parkway, which was the only link to the west that was open during the 2013 flood. So we felt it was quite important to keep that alive in future events. And the banks were still also damaged. We hadn't done any mitigation work or rehab, so worked on rehabbing those banks, and then also reducing the risk to existing developments in that downstream area. And that one was a combination of FREC, DRP, and Alberta Transportation was also a partner in this to actually work on around the culvert. They provided the money we basically managed a project for them in that area. I will now pass it on to Joel, who will be actually telling you about that project we did this summer.
Mr. Packus, first time here in front of council, isn't it?
It is, yes.
Welcome to the fun.
Thank you. Thank you. Three Sisters Creek construction had three main areas of focus. Zone 1, which was just upstream of the multi-use pedestrian bridge. Zone 2, which was just downstream of the bridge and extended towards the upstream side of the culvert. And Zone 3, which was just downstream of the culvert underneath Three Sisters Parkway. So this image is the completed right side bank of Zone 1. So the focus of the work up in Zone 1 was to protect and armor the pedestrian bridge abutments.
I'm sorry, when you say right side, you mean the west or the east side?
That would be the east side.
East side.
Yeah. The technique used for protection on this project is called stone pitching. Stone pitching is a type of rock placement with a finished product that looks a lot more like stone masonry compared to just general rock placement like you'd see along like the Bow River. A consistent slope in all planes, so up and downstream, up the bank of the creek, and rock to rock needs to be maintained. So yeah, it's almost a smooth surface. It was noted during construction that people like to access the creek at this area, so a small set of steps was included to allow for people to access that a little more safely. So this would be the west side bridge abutment in Zone 1. So we found that there were some very major boulders buried beside the bridge abutments in this area. We decided to leave these large boulders because it would be too much to pull them out and replace them. And we just placed riprap rocks on top of that. So that's more of the kind of just general rock placement that you'd see. Since the left abutment is out of the creek bed, it was deemed appropriate to use just general riprap placement as protection, knowing that we have a solid foundation with the large boulders underneath. Deadfall was removed from upstream and from this small little island that you can see here, and that's just to reduce the risk of damming under the bridge and in the culvert downstream. So this image shows completed work on the right bank of Zone 2 and work undergoing on the left bank. So the process of stone pitching is quite involved. One person was always in an excavator, and they were in charge of rock placement, which encompasses rotating the rock, ensuring they have a supply of rocks and backfilled stocked up, and making sure that they have proper fitment with all the surrounding rocks. It can take up to 20 minutes just to place one rock, so it's quite demanding. The operator had one person working with them directly, and that person would choose the rocks on the ground, make sure they were maintaining proper grade, and adding any fill behind the rocks to maintain that grade. On top of that, there was a requirement to keep down turbidity in the creek. So the operator first had to lay down a layer of boulders that they were using to place for the stone pitching, which were unstable and uneven, which added to the complexity of this project. So the purpose of having proper grades and tight fits rather than using just general riprap, like you'd see on the Bow River, is that steep creeks generally will see faster flows with more debris coming down at a quicker rate. So having the tight fits and proper grades in the stone pitching just prevents any large trees or boulders from coming down and ripping out any one of those boulders, which would compromise the whole bank integrity. So lower down, there's a small waterfall, and this is just above the culvert going under the Three Sisters Parkway. Since the bank turned into bedrock in this area, and so since we couldn't trench the bedrock, we used a layer of concrete which was poured on top of the bedrock, and then the keystone, the bottom supporting stone, was placed in the concrete, and the rest of the wall could be built up on top of that. Down in Zone 3 so this was in the Alberta Transportation right-of-way. The town helped facilitate the design and construction of Zone 3, and funding was provided through Alberta Transportation. In 2013, the left bank eroded from overland water coming over the Three Sisters Parkway. So this was really to protect the infrastructure of the road as well as the crossbow landing housing units. So overall, this project was a success and a great finished product that we can model off for future projects. And I'll pass it back to Felix now.
Great, thank you. I remember the residents of the condos there with their red chairs all gathered, watching all the work. They were having fun with it. After like 5 o'clock, they'd all bring their drinks out and watch whatever was going on.
Well, I think the residents there were walking the site on a daily basis and providing comments and feedback.
Yeah.
This one is a little bit off, maybe change it, you know. No, they were quite involved, implicated in the project, those guys too. They're really good up there. But yeah, no more questions for Joel? That's it?
Nope.
Really? Okay. You sure?
Yeah, we're sure.
Just for me, eh? Okay, sounds good.
Yeah.
Now, Cougar Creek. So that's where it is. I don't think I've got to go through that too much here. But Cougar Creek, a little bit of its own agenda. We'll go through progress updates, what's been done in the last, well, I don't know, last time I was here, like probably a year and a half ago now.
Is it?
And then we'll talk about costing and constructability review that we're undertaking, look at alternative construction approaches, discuss the approval status, and then look at funding and scheduling the project. So first update is finally pretty much finished the landscaping of Cougar Creek back last year, and pathways are all in. We've added. See you guys. We'll see you next time.
Adios.
Adios. We'll talk soon. Yeah, I guess. That's okay.
Come again.
Yeah, I'll keep going.
The only other engineer.
Can I go on now?
Yes, please.
Okay. So the pathways are finished. We've installed all the garbage bins, recycling bins, all that stuff. Parking lot has been finished too, including pit toilets. And we finished the landscaping on the inside of the creek, should I say, like between the pathway and concrete mats. where the topsoil has been added and seeded. More plant material has been installed, and also, as you can see on the photo here, like we infilled the concrete mats for the upper 2 meters approximately, and seeded those. The remaining part of the ECMs have not been done and won't be done just yet. We're looking a little bit at what's going to happen, how easy it's going to be to maintain that. We know it's definitely going to be a little bit of an issue with weeds growing, and it's pretty complicated on that slope to actually manage that. So decided to go phase approach there too, but also the remaining ACMs might be covered in the future as part of further channel improvements that might be done here. There's also the area around the Coeur Creek Rink and Elkhorn Boulevard itself, around the culvert that has not been finished, and that's going to be completed after the structure is finished for upstream. Something else we've done too, physical scale modeling was completed in the summer of 2018. Well, hold on, just wait until the next photo. That's even more cool than you think, I think. It's huge. That thing is a 1 in 20 scale of the spillway and the bottom of the structure, which is the tunnel you can see there on the right side. It was done in the lab in Edmonton, and it really focused on the performance of the spillway and the outlet of the tunnel, as well as the energy dissipation provided by the stilling basin at the outlet of the spillway. So that's the size of the thing. You can see people there on the left side. I went there to witness a test that we're doing, spend the whole day there, and it's you feel like a kid in a sandbox, but much better than that. You've got lots of water to play with, and it's really interesting. In a lab like this, you can actually place, change the geometry of your spillway, add gravel in the stilling basin, see what happens. There's a lot of things you can actually do. Yeah, that was completed this summer. Apart from that, a lot of work has been done also, but the EIA was deemed complete by AEP in March of 2018, and then the NRCB issued a decision in November of 2018 on the project. We'll get back to that. So something else we've undertaken is we issued a request for proposal in spring of 2018 to find a well-established Canadian firm that could actually, that specialized really in dam construction and mountainous terrain, such as we have in the Bow Valley here. The scope of work for that, including project cost estimating, constructability review and value engineering of the structure, procurement services for when we're ready to go for construction, and also the construction administration and project management throughout construction of the project. We awarded the project to Canadian Projects Limited, which is a Calgary-based company. Been in the business for a long time, focusing on hydro, solar, and also wind turbines installation.
So you referenced earlier that it's difficult to find an outfit with experience in dam building, particularly in mountainous terrain. Do they have any of that? I mean, have they worked in the mountains?
Yeah, so they've, I'd say over the last 15, 20 years, they've done several, what we call, well, what's called like smaller dams. So, you know, dams in the 20, 30 meter range, north of Revelstoke, close to the coast. Yeah, they probably have, in the last 15 years, done, I can't remember the exact number, 4 or 5 of those. And they work on rehab of some other ones. They also work as a third-party reviewers for Alberta and Parks dam safety. So for example, when TransAlta needs to do a dam safety review, so this company, CPL, can actually work for them. So yeah, they do have quite impressive, actually, resume of similar type of projects, yeah, to some extent.
Great.
Yep.
Another acronym to remember, CPL.
CPL.
That one.
Yeah.
BGC, CPLs, like.
That there's so many, yeah. But yeah, so we've basically started working with them right away. And the first phase of work that they did was really focusing on high-level cost estimates that were provided to us in August of 2018, which basically at that point showed that showed a risk that the bids, if we would go to tender with the current project, the bids could actually come back in over budget. So after that initial review of the cost, they went under, they started doing the constructability review to find cost savings and to see where the project can be improved and changed to actually reduce those costs. So a number of options were considered through that, and they looked pretty much at everything that, from their point of view anyway, could provide some big changes. So they also requested budgetary quotes from 5 contractors, mostly around the Valley and Calgary and kind of Revelstoke area, to inform those cost estimates to make sure that what they had in there were actually appropriate. And then basically in November of 2018, so not too long ago, we just got the finalized version of the cost estimates that basically showed that the project, what was going on here? What happened there? That the project is about, would most likely be about 10% over budget if we just keep going with what we had proposed. So based on that, they looked further into the design and they recommended that we consider alternative construction approaches to basically find ways to actually build this project with the same intent, same risk reduction as what we have currently. So those approaches, they do provide that same risk reduction. They actually, same location, which means that we can use all the data that's been accumulated up to now and from geotech and all the other things. They're still designed to the same high standard of the Canadian Dam Association guidelines, the brand new Alberta Dam and Canal Safety Directive now. It's not a guideline anymore. So all of those. So I'm going to go and show you a current design so we can compare a little bit. So that's what probably you've seen as the last update. So the structure is basically earth and rockfill embankment dam structure with a concrete spillway on the downstream face of the structure. It also features the outlet, the low-level outlet through the tunnel in the east abutment. And also the access road, which a little bit of is missing here in the sketch, but to get up to the top, the crest of the structure and down on the other side, we need to have a road that goes up, extends here, and turns back in here. And one of the main wildlife habitat and corridor is actually right here. So the alternative approaches, the real main change is the spillway structure is actually not on the dam itself now, it's on the east abutment. So we're swapping things around a little bit, using a rock cut spillway instead of a concrete structure on the structure itself.
So the spillway is no longer like over the concrete,
it's
off
rock.
there to the,
It's rock. So basically on the east abutment, we have some renderings too, so you'll better understand, but it's basically side of the mountain there, you basically cut down to create a spillway there. Yeah. So
cut into the cliff.
Correct. Yeah. What it does, that it reduces the complexity of the structure massively, and the rock being removed here is actually being used to build the structure right there, which provides a reduction of truck traffic in town of about 80%, which is really one of the really big positive coming out of that too, is for residents of Cougar Creek and Elk Run Boulevard and all that, it's a massive reduction in truck traffic that we're seeing with this. Something else that can now be flipped is the outlet can now be through a steel pipe on the rock bench on the west abutment. We don't have any conflict with a spillway in the structure anymore, both at the inlet and outlet. Much simpler also to construct and reduces complexity of and construction risks of a tunnel on the west abutment. And the access road can now be placed mostly on the structure, so we still have a small portion at the bottom that's really just at the edge, but the rest is actually on the structure itself. Goes up here and then comes back down on this side. And something else that's being proposed is to use upstream of the structure as a fill material source. So basically remove some of the alluvium that's there that was transported through the 2013 flood event, take that to actually construct the structure too, because we can definitely use some of that material that also reduces the truck traffic and also might help reduce the maintenance requirements, because now we have a little bit less material accumulated there. So before we have to go and clean out the upstream side of the structure, provides a little bit of storage there too.
Are you going to show us like a cross section of the rock cut spillway, or is that?
Yeah, I don't have a cross section to show, but I've got a rendering that's
okay.
pretty graphic, I'd say. So I think you'll see it.
And by going to this design, you mentioned the impact on the corridor that's there, the wildlife corridor is reduced?
Yeah, so next few slides I've got a little bit more details on how it impacts like pretty much everything we've looked at through the EI, because that was something that's quite important for us to actually ensure that the project wouldn't change in terms of their EI findings, and if there's extra mitigation to do or monitoring or whatever. Yeah.
Okay.
So the advantages to those changes, it's reduced complexity in construction and the risk associated with those complexities. Shorter construction duration, so we're, because we can actually do a lot of things simultaneously, the construction duration is greatly reduced, potentially up to a year, depending on when we can actually start a project. Significant reduction in trucking required through town. Also, reduced construction cost, which brings the project, high likelihood of the project to be on budget with those changes. So that's a little bit of a footprint change. So on the left side is the original design, so you can see that road going in on this side. This in red here is the main footprint of the structure. That's the road on the upstream side. And now with the revised footprint, it would be basically the portion of the road is here. Footprint of the structure is pretty much exactly the same. And the spillway on this side here. And the inundation area upstream of it, if the structure is fully impounded, is the same. So there's an increase of footprint in the project of about 0.5 acres, if I remember well. Hectares or acres, I can't remember now. Anyway, one of those two. Hectares, yeah. So, yeah, that's...
Sorry, so an increased footprint with the new design. So where's that? Where do I see that?
So we're decreasing the footprint of the road here significantly, but with the addition of the spillway on this side here, we're actually increasing the footprint, right? So it's not we're not increasing as much as just adding this because we're removing the road, but the road footprint is not as big as the spillway footprint. Yeah. And so that was the last rendering we had done previously, and this is a new one. You can see the road going up on this side here to the top of the structure. The structure height is the same as before, and the spillway on this side. So this view is actually elevated. It's not a view you would get from houses or in the creek itself. And then we're working also at greening up the spillway too, as we're proposing to do with the main face of the structure. So it's not, yeah, it's not as visually disruptive.
So is the lip of the new spillway, is the lip more or less the same elevation as the spillway would have been in the structure?
It has, yeah, it's exactly the same. We're designing into the same protection level, and it has to provide the same spillway capacity as what we had before in terms of our maximum flood that we have to pass. So yeah, so that the elevation, basically, it's just at the end here is the same as what it would be up here.
And what's required to build that spillway? What sort of operation is it?
It's blasting and excavating. So the concept right now is to be looking at something like one or maximum 2 blasts a week that could be scheduled. So for example, every Tuesday at 1 p.m. we would have a blast going, which was already required for the road construction and also the tunnel construction. So that doesn't really change. What changes the quantity, we're doing more. And again, we're taking the rock from here and transporting it and building a structure with it.
So how, I mean, what's the profile of the spillway? Is it quite a deep channel or shallow?
It is somewhat deep in some areas. So the deepest is, I believe it's right around here, this corner. And I don't have the latest numbers, but it's probably around 20 meters.
20 meters of, like, reduced, like digging down into the mountainside 20 meters?
Yep. Yeah, and then some areas, like at the bottom here, it's definitely a lot less. On this side here, it's pretty much minimal, is almost nothing. So depending where you are in this profile, it changes for sure. CPL is looking at ways to balance the requirement of the design itself, what we need to pass through the spillway, looking at how much material we can get out of that versus minimizing the footprint of it and depth and things like that. So one thing that's being shown here is one thing that was quite important, especially with meetings with Alberta Parks, was wildlife movement through there. So for example, they don't want to have any wildlife getting in and getting trapped. So wildlife movement is possible at the bottom here. Egress at the top also. And we've looked at adding some ramps to get wildlife also in and out of the spillway from the sides too. This is potentially a movement that wildlife might want to use once structure is built, so to keep it going and get them out there too.
Sorry, so you're saying that the design would be such that wildlife could move through the spillway?
That's what we're currently looking at, and it's a desire from Alberta
What
Parks.
about human access in behind the structure?
So we don't want any humans to go in the spillway area. However, on the structure itself, we still have the requirement to actually keep humans and wildlife to be able to go over the structure, as we always have. So
they'd come up the west bank and skirt around the structure and just continue up on the west bank?
Yeah, we expect there's going to be, some people will just use a road to get up and keep going on that, and we definitely expect there's going to be a climbers trails or hikers trails being.
What about those crazy bikers though? What are they going to do?
The who?
Those crazy bikers.
We've been avoiding the discussion with parks about that. Yeah, it's definitely, there's talks about putting gates and stuff so that they don't start building trails up there and things like that. It's definitely not something that park is really interested in up there with bicycles.
We're going to find mountain bikers riding that spillway like a big woohoo.
Well, yeah, there's been talks about, like, in the winter, can you ski and all kind of stuff. I mean, there's not enough snow around here to ski, typically speaking, but there's, through the disposition that we require for this project, because it's in the wildland park, they can actually give us the power actually to create, make the spillway area, for example, a place where nobody should go and can go, and we can actually find people for that. So one thing that's been discussed, for example, is to sign this whole side to ensure that nobody goes in there. We can actually find people, even if it's within the wildland park, because it's our lease land at this point. And that's most likely something that's going to be looked at to minimize the number of people going in, including mountain bikers who want to do stuff like that. Yeah.
Okay. So you're going to talk about the impact on the NRCB decision from that?
Yeah. This is also another view. It's actually quite hard to see, but that's what we want to show from Cannon Road for the residents of the Cannon Road here. So you can see the top of the structure and a little bit of the lower section, and the spillway is fairly well hidden, right? So the spillway is visible really when you're right around the corner, right in your face there. Yeah. Yeah, I've been told I've got to speed up here a little bit, so stop asking questions for a while, I guess. So a project update has been provided to dam safety and their third-party reviewers and our expert reviewer in December of 2018. Before we're like, okay, can we actually go forward with this? The review was mostly positive from them. They quite like some of the solutions being presented here. And we also did presented a project update too with Alberta Parks, Alberta Infrastructure and Parks, people dealing with the EIA and also the Water Act approval stuff, and also with NRCB in January, like about, well, pretty much 2 weeks ago now, before coming here. So that's what I was talking about a little bit about, the impacts on the EIA findings. So that was super important too. We've been working with our consultant since we started looking at some of those potential changes to ensure that our EIA findings would still be valid. And aquatic environment includes all those specialties. And the revised design is basically in terms of water movement through the structure and over the structure and all that is pretty much the same. We have the exact same requirements there. So the revised design does not alter any of the, doesn't change the findings of the original assessment. That's the key thing about that one. In terms of human environment, it covers all these fields. And the assessment of design changes, very similar. The revised design does not change the original assessment. And we have some positive outcomes, which are reduced costs and improved project viability, and also significant reduction in traffic through town. In terms of terrestrial environment, covers the terrain, the vegetation, wildlife, biodiversity. So there are some changes to footprint and clear area. We need to remove a little bit more trees. However, the findings themselves do not change. The overall or research area, when we did the EIA, did cover the footprint area too. Not the footprint, but the spillway footprint area. So we know there's no rare plants or anything like that in there. So that's still valid. And for wildlife, we do have a change to habitat availability, connectivity, and mortality risks relative to the original EIA. But they find that the findings themselves are do not change. So on wildlife itself, obviously there's more going on. So the rock cut spillway is the biggest change relative to wildlife. However, the reduction in heavy traffic truck is likely to offset the increased disturbance from the increased blasting that we have. Incorporating the wildlife ramps into the spillway will help improve that connectivity between the two different sides of the creek. So that's one of the things that we're still working on to, with parks to actually nail that down. And the access road and downstream face of the structure, it reduces
the loss of higher quality habitat that we have on the western abutment, where we did have the original road. So that's also compensating for the spillway to some extent. And then we're still allowing wildlife and human to go over its structure. Those are the main changes that have been looked at. Going on with that, we need to provide a formal written project update to AEP and also NRCB. So we'll be submitting that fairly shortly. We'll also have to update Treaty 7 First Nations on the project changes. So that's going to happen in the next few weeks here. And part of that, that's the part of the process we're not 100% sure how it's going to happen or how it's going to go. But NRCB will most likely have to amend their decision or provide an addendum to their decision based on the project changes that we're bringing forward here. And then our water application package will be forthcoming once all the details are sorted, and we're good to go with the final configuration.
So the water application, you're waiting for the NRCB? No, so they'll go ahead same time as the NRCB reconsideration?
Yeah, so the Water Act, I mean, we wouldn't get Water Act approval without NRCB approval, but we can still do our Water Act application even if NRCB is not totally finished on their side. Yeah, and part of the Water Act is the dam safety review, which is also, it's been ongoing for a while, and they've already seen those changes.
Got any sort of inkling from anybody up there how much time it may take for them to consider the revision?
We've been talking about that quite a bit, and I mean, we know NRCB, it was from March to November. That's how long it took them to review the full project. So now it's an update, so we're expecting that to be obviously shorter than that. Total time, we're not 100% sure. What we're counting on anyway is the potential increase in timing for approvals would be compensated by the decreased construction duration. So hopefully we're not affecting the overall completion of the project.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And in terms of land disposition, which is led by the province, it's our lease that we require for the wildland park. We're still working with the province on that to actually ensure that we also have the land disposition in place when we're ready to construct the project. And that's my second to last slide here, budget funding. So left side here, approved budget, it shows, well, the first column is all our funding sources for this project. And then the approved budget, that's the funding we've received. And then the funds expended up to now on the project. And then with the revised construction approaches, we're again expecting that the project will be on budget and will go forward. And then scheduling, to answer a little bit of a question, it's a permitting time frame is still to be determined. We'll probably know more once we have our project update in with NRCB and EIA. And the expectation would be to start as soon as we can once we have approvals on the project, and then construction duration somewhere around 24 months, and then a year plus for deficiencies and landscaping, finalization, and things like that, rehab. So that's it. That's
Great.
what I have to say today.
And just one last bit of curiosity. So the proposed changes, is that something you would have run past, was it Alpenfrau that were involved in the original design? Or
Yeah.
BGC, I don't know who else would take a look at that?
Yeah, so up to now, it's been our Norbert Morgenstern, our expert reviewer. He was the first one to look at them. And then Dam Safety and their third-party reviewer, which is also a company that similar to CPL, just bigger really, that does a lot of dam construction work. And then Alpen for CHD, they've seen this, and they are currently working with CPL to most likely become a sub of CPL
through the rest of the project,
To be a witch?
to be a sub-consultant.
Oh, okay.
So they would still be involved, and that's our preference too, for them to stay involved in the project, especially because of they're quite specialized with the debris flow, debris flood, and yeah, that kind of work.
Great. Okay, well, that was a pretty comprehensive report. Are there questions at this point? We'll have more coming up.
I'm sure.
But it's really been an interesting review. Thanks for putting that together.
Welcome.
And it's just, I mean, 6 years now, and I guess another few years, so practically a 10-year project, start to finish.
Yeah.
Well, okay, so thanks for being here to provide that report. We'll call a 10-minute break at this time, and we'll reassemble for the report on XYZ and Echo Canyon Creek's hazard assessment. Canyon Creek's Hazard and Risk Assessment. Mr. Asarte.
Thank you. Quick introduction. I have with me Dr. Matthias Jakob. He's a principal geoscientist with BGC Engineering and one of the leading international practitioners in geosciences. With him, he's got Emily Mose from his team, a geological engineer that's helped him with the XYZ and Echo Canyon Creek studies. So I'll turn it over to Matthias. He'll take you through a presentation on the work that they've done and the reports that they've produced, as well as some additional information just as background on Steep Creek processes and the events from 2013.
Welcome back to our council chamber, Dr. Jakob.
Thank you very much.
It's been a long time.
It has been. Thank you very much, Mayor and Council. Thanks, Andy, for the introduction. It is an absolute pleasure to be back here again. The unfortunate thing is you're running out of creeks to study. There's more good news. The XYZ Creek and Echo Canyon Creeks are actually much, much lower risk than anything else we've studied so far. But I'll get into that in a little bit more detail. It's a bit of an understatement that Ms. Mose has helped me. She had actually burdened the lion's share of the work, just up front. And she will be talking about the mitigation, being an engineer. So I'll give you a quick overview of what we'll be talking about today. There's about 40 slides, and please do feel free to, as you do already, ask questions at any time during the presentation. So first of all, why is Canmore still studying creeks? What's so special about the steep creeks? You have already a substantial background on that, but I'll just reiterate a few key points. Then I'll talk briefly about the events of June 2013, but not giving you a full overview of what you already know, truly focusing on these 4 study creeks that we tackled and ask the question, what happened there? Specifically, why was it not catastrophic there while it was on these other creeks? Then I'll go very systematically through the different creeks, giving a bit of a broad overview of their geomorphology and touching on the geology. Then go straight into the gamut of hazard analytical techniques that we use to create these model ensembles to make sense of what we see in the field and in the labs. That then leads seamlessly into the risk assessment, where we do ask again the question, what is the chance of life loss risk and economic losses? And with that in mind then, Canmore having advanced to really being the Canadian leader in Steep Creek hazard and risk assessment, we then say, does that necessitate mitigation? And in what form would mitigation occur? From passive measures, i.e. land use zoning, to active or engineered measures. Again, the good news is we're not talking about $40 million. So just as a quick summary, what's so special about Steep Creeks? Well, there's a tiny little sketch here on the screen that says, first of all, you need relief, then you need water, and then you need sediment, all of which you have in abundance. And when you combine those 3, you have a steep creek. Hazard, as long as there's some element at risk that could be damaged. Now we have this whole transition of processes from flood, which is the Bow River overtopping its banks, to debris floods, which means a lot of grains embedded in the bed of the streams get mobilized. And then we have debris flows, which is truly a landslide process, where you have about half of your volume of your mixture being sediment. And it assumes much more the consistency of concrete, or cow poop if you want. And then last not least, that goes hand in hand with the impact forces from left to right. Floods, relatively moderate impact forces, to debris flows, very high impact forces, simply due to the fact that the debris flows are much more rapid. And since impact forces relate to the squared of velocity, that makes a huge difference when they impact something rigid. Viscosity, same thing. Floods have very low viscosities and debris flows, given their typical characteristics, have high viscosities. The sketch on the right upper hand side I'll use the mouse for both screens, shows sediment concentration increasing towards the right, with the floods being very low, a few percent, and then the debris flows having at least half, sometimes up to 70% volume sediment. This is how they look in plan view. The steeper the creek bed, the more likely you get into debris flow territory, and the velocities increase with debris flows getting sometimes as fast as 10 meters per second. So that's full out sprint speed for world athletes, versus a flood is still something you can jog away from in most instances. And here's a good example. Think of this creek here. So this could be and is modeled by Stone Creek, steep, small watershed, less than a square kilometer, prone to debris flows. And then here right next door to it, sort of the Cougar Creek scenario, much lower gradient, much larger watershed in Cougar Creek case, 40 plus square kilometers. And then the Fans, low gradient in case of Cougar, steep Fan in case of the type of creeks that we're looking at, Stone, as well as XYZ and Echo Canyon Creek. This is a lovely video that I'll play and I narrate as I play it. This is a time-lapse photography of how a fan builds at a laboratory, at the Steep Creek Laboratory at UBC. And it is actually modeled in terms of its grain size after Three Sisters Creek. So what you see there is a whole bunch of things. So what is modeled is a flood, sort of a 2 to 3 year flood, and sediment is being input, as all of these creeks do get a fair bit of sediment input. And as you see, the channel does not want to stay in one location. So these are debris floods. The channel swifts around as it builds up its course by sediment constantly, and then swoops over to another side of the fan. What you see here in the time lapse of 1 minute or so is really what happens over thousands of years. But it gives you a very good idea on how these fans form and what their natural status is, what their natural tendency is. They do want to shift. They do not want to be enclosed in a very narrow channel. You can force them, but then you have to deal with the sediment and you have to deal with the water, which is exactly what's being done. For example, at Cougar Creek, as Felix has just and Andy have elaborated upon. Then here is a video of a true debris flow. More hyperconcentrated afterflow. And these frontal surges are infinitely more destructive than would be just water. So just to summarize then, if you were to look at a cross-section of a stream, and often you do find these little benches or paired terraces, paired because you often find them on both sides. If you had a 200-year flood, clear-water flood, which is what most riverine mitigation is designed to in BC, in Alberta, it's typically the 100-year flood, you see that would be the river level. A debris flood can be substantially higher, particularly if the debris flood were to be triggered by a landslide dam outbreak flood, as is the case at, or can be the case at Cougar Creek, or by a glacial lake breaking out, or by a man-made dam breaking. And then just in relation, if you look at debris flows, their discharge can be a lot higher. So recognizing the correct process is absolutely key for any mitigation, as well as, of course, for the modeling. This is a photo, this gray-haired person, that's me. This is a photo that was taken only a couple of months ago in North Vancouver, the day after, or hours after, a debris flow roared through this channel. And it gives you an idea. So this would be the cross-section, roughly, of the 200-year flow, which in this creek, 200-year return period flow, which in this creek is approximately 3 cubic meters per second. The debris flow that actually came through, and as they characteristically do in channel bends, it's super elevated, so it's not straight across, was 100 times higher. So 300 cubic meters per second. So you can imagine that the design for only a flood for anything, be it a culvert or a bridge, would be terrifically under-designed for the true process, for the true damaging process. And here you have an example of the typical consequences of a debris flood. This was Highway 99 connecting Pemberton with Whistler and the CN Railway up here. The damage, not so much through impact, but through vast bank erosion during this October 2003 event that undercut the abutments and led to the failure of the bridge here, which unfortunately led to 5 fatalities when people drove this highway at night and just bet that there is a bridge, as we all would. And then some of them were not found. So let's go back then to Canmore. We are all very familiar with those photos, and I don't have to elaborate on them. Just reminding you that in this particular case, in this debris flood on Cougar Creek, it was truly the bank erosion that led to the highest damages. The bank erosion was due to the fact that the artificial channel filled in with sediments, and the creek decided to attack its banks to reach something equilibrium. This is not the case for X, Y, and Z creeks. Those 4 creeks are prone to overflows. So, what happened then at those creeks, which was rather unspectacular compared to what happened at Cougar Creek, Exshaw, Jura Creek, and so on and so forth? Well, there was some action, some debris movement, and you can see still here, this is a photo from just last year, that these are the remnants of the debris that was moved. Much less catastrophic. At White Creek, it was a bit more dramatic, but luckily the town of Canmore had built these sturdy wooden walls the year before because there was a strong runoff event, much shorter duration, but still very high intensities. And these deflection walls turned out to be very effective. In fact, they prevented damage to the houses that are on this left side here. At Z Creek, we witnessed an avulsion, a small avulsion, but relatively little damage to the homes below. Why? So why did we see so much less damage on those 3 creeks where we saw so much damage on the large creeks? Well, the answer lies in the very different rainfall intensities that occurred. This is what's called an intensity duration frequency curve. On the horizontal axis, you have the duration of the rainfall all the way from 5 minutes to 24 hours. On the vertical axis, on this side here, you have the intensities in millimeters per hour. And here, you have these connecting black lines that tell you what intensities, at what duration rain you get for different return periods. From the lowermost line being the 2-year return period to the uppermost line being the 100-year return period. Now, when we plot the storm of June 2013 on this graph, we see something quite striking. We see that for 24-hour period or even 12-hour period or 6-hour period, the storm was record-breaking. It was a 100-year plus storm. However, when we look at shorter durations, let's take the 1-hour duration here, it was much less spectacular. It was only a 5-year storm. And when we go to even lower, if we were to extrapolate this blue curve for 30 minutes duration, it would be only a 2-year storm. So a storm that occurs on average every other year. For debris flow creeks, particularly these very small ones that we're dealing here with XYZ, the so-called time of concentration, which means from the moment the raindrop hits the upper watershed to the time it zaps by the fan apex, is very, very short. So for those small watersheds, the short duration intensity is much more critical in causing a debris flow or a disaster than how much it rains over the course of a day or 2 or 3. That is the very reason why during this 2013 event there wasn't as much damage as compared to the much larger creeks. And that's important because it would be very easy for members of the public or other ones to conclude that given that this was a multiple 100-year storm, as it was publicized widely, that it didn't do much to these creeks, therefore nothing could happen. But that's a fallacy. And that's why the town of Canmore decided wisely to examine these creeks despite the fact that in 2013 so little happened. So how are these looking like then? Well, they're similar and yet they're not. So the outlier to some degree is X Creek because it is much larger. Here's an overview shot sort of angling across the valley. X Creek has an east tributary that goes well into the Alpine. There's an Alpine basin here, vast talus slopes that produce quite a bit of sediment, unlike, say, Stone Creek or unlike Y and Z creeks. And it has a west tributary that's very steep and resembles a lot like Y Creek. Y Creek is smaller yet, very steep. Snow avalanches tumble down, and they are relevant because they do tend to clean debris, or at least move debris from one location to another. And then Z Creek is the smallest of the three watersheds, right here on the fringes, really not much of a watershed in the upper areas, and all bound by the cliffs. And the development, as you can see, skirts down here, is on the fans, on the alluvial fans of those three creeks, however, on the distal part, so the further part. And that's, of course, good news, very different from Cougar Creek, where development encroaches all the way close to the fan apex. Therefore, the impact forces are lower. How do the fans then look like? Well, let's start with the image on the right side. Here we have the Z Creek fan. That's an orthophoto. You can see the vegetation nicely, as well as the development. And the red dashed lines show the approximate fan boundary. So the fan boundaries of these three creeks barely skirt the development. They do not reach across the entire development. In this case, the fan does not reach the proposed development by Hillcroft in this area. And that is relevant. Now you say this is not a very typical fan shape. What's up with these hourglass-shaped little breakouts here? The reason for that is that at the end of the last ice age, so some 11,000 years ago, there was a glacier covering the middle of the Bow Valley, so we would be under substantial ice right now here. As the glacier down-wasted or lost its mass towards the end of the ice age and the beginning of the Holocene era, it left these characteristics, linear features that you see throughout the whole Bow Valley. We call them came terrace. They're glaciofluvial deposits. So the glacier shed sediment and water redistributed, and they are flanking the valley along here. There's also some bedrock underneath it. And what that does is it encourages deposition of debris in many of these spaces, and in a few spaces the debris has managed to cut through it, and that's what led to these little mini subfans. And they are relevant because in our numerical modeling that you'll see later, you will be able to identify these hourglass-shaped breakouts as they are preferred flow path, and therefore push risk specifically in those locations. Mitigation has already occurred on these creeks in the form of rather effective wooden walls. They're not very obtrusive. They're actually quite aesthetically pleasing as far as I'm concerned. Riprap has been placed to avoid erosion through clear water floods, and then they go into the storm water system. Echo Canyon, not to be forgotten. Echo Canyon resembles in its upper watershed much more like Stone Creek that Felix talked about earlier. There's bedrock up here. Bedrock causes rockfall, creates these talus slopes, and then you have an interesting sort of step topography on Echo Canyon Creek, where you have waterfalls and climbing routes, then a little talus slope, much like the Grand Canyon, really, and then another waterfall, and then another talus slope, and then eventually you come out on the fan. And this is really the fan of Echo Canyon Creek right here, with all the horse paddocks and various other horse facilities. And this is really the deposit from the 2013 flood, with the approximate extent of the avulsion channel, avulsion being when the creek jumps out of its banks. Any questions so far before I get into the little bit more technical aspects?
Looks like we're good.
Good. So we have an ever-increasing toolbox in the analysis. We have anecdotal information. We interview people. We look at air photographs. We look at trees, soil development. We trench and sample radiocarbon dating, and so on and so forth. Why would we do all that? Just because we can? Not quite. By combining different techniques, what we're trying to do is really what the weather forecasters do, or the climatologists when it comes to climate change, or the hurricane forecasters. We try to create an ensemble of models. We use this technique and that technique and this technique, combine them, then use some judgment and say, what is our best estimate? That gives us infinitely more confidence than if we were to rely on one method only. And since we did the original studies at Cougar Creek and the other creeks in the Bow Valley, we have discovered or invented new methods that we're able to put into these studies. So let's talk about hydrology first. Hydrology, so this is really how much rain, and how does the rain then eventually translate into runoff. Why is it important if we talk about debris flows? Well, debris flows need water. Without water, they would just be dry rock fall. So we need to analyze and reanalyze from what we've done in 2013 because we have more data and climate change science has advanced. So we did that. So this is what we call a frequency analysis, and you may have seen those before. We have down here the return periods. You can forget these numbers for the time being. And here you have the precipitation amounts. Then you use the entire data record that we have, and you fit different extreme value distributions to it. What you can see is the 2005 and the 2013 rainfall events are not plotting nicely on the lines. The reason for that is that they are from a different hydroclimatic sample. They aren't your typical storms. There was some meteorology that was quite different from the rest of it. Yet, you cannot really run statistics with just 2 data points. That's why it's meshed together with the others. And down here, you see the best fits and then the various confidence intervals of the rainfall amounts for the different return periods. And that is crucial not just for the debris flow numerical modeling, but we also need to account for the floods that are associated with the debris flows, which we model separately in order to make sure that we don't forget one crucial aspect and that we understand how far beyond the runout of the debris flows could we expect some form of damage. So, we also asked the question, is there anything unusual about our creeks that we should pay attention to? For example, this plot here relates the watershed area on a logarithmic scale to the fan area. And in the past studies that we've done elsewhere, we found that there's creeks at the very upper envelope where, for example, the fan area is particularly large with regard to the watershed area. And then we need to ask the question, why is that an outlier? In some cases, that's due to a rock avalanche having created the fan. And then, of course, we have to ask the question, could there be another one? But our fans, our creeks, X, Y, and Z in Echo Canyon, they plot really nicely in the middle of the range, so we don't think there's anything particularly outlandish about them. We also have here a plot that allows us to categorize the debris, the creeks, by their dominating and therefore most hazardous process. One is called the Melton ratio, which is the square root out of watershed relief by watershed area. The other one is watershed length. And this is a data set from hundreds of fans in Alberta. And what you see here is in this big bubble, this is a mix of these two interrelated variables that tell us they're prone to debris flows. And if it's in this bubble, it's mostly debris floods, and if it's in this bubble, it's mostly floods. So that's a key, because we need to identify the correct process. If we get the process wrong, the hazard analysis is wrong, the risk analysis is wrong, the mitigation is wrong. What else do we do? Well, this is a LiDAR shaded relief image. So we have the fortuitous situation here in Canmore that we have this very high precision topography that we can analyze, because it looks through the trees and it looks at every nook and cranny that we can see in the field. In fact, with high resolution LiDAR, if you were sunbathing down there, you'd probably be able to zoom in and identify your body, if you so desire. So we map out the scarps, where the debris comes from, where there is possibly deep-seated failures in bedrock, which path the debris would take, and all that informs us as to the debris supply mechanisms, which is a critical factor in determining just how big these events can get. We, of course, also hike the creeks, and in this particular case, we got to about here, after which progress with our technical climbing gear was no longer possible, and that's the rest we cover off by helicopter and remote sensing techniques to not kill ourselves, which is frowned upon in our company. So then we have, again, the great advantage in this part of Canada that we have air photos back to 1947, so well beyond my vintage, and it allows us to see, first of all, how the fan has evolved, where the creek has been over the last 70 or so years, and even measure the areas. We have to do a thing called orthorectification, which means we take out the focal length bias that is introduced by taking a photograph, and then we can actually measure areas of previous debris floods and relate those to, or determine their respective volumes. We can do that for all the air photographs, and we did do that for all the air photographs there are, and therefore we're able to establish a record of when these events happen and how large they were. Another technique then that we use is we core trees, and trees react to impact by debris flows and debris floods, either by a thing called a traumatic resin tissue, which is something we can look at under the microscope, and we know that tree was quite unhappy during that year. And if we find that signal in many trees for the same years, we say, aha, there was a debris flood. They can also be scarred by impacts or create reaction wood. So we go in with our tree borer, which doesn't kill the tree, bring it back to the lab, sand it, analyze it, and come up with a chronology of events. Then we can plot it on a map. We can then sketch out where that event may have been compared with the air photograph analysis. Then with these techniques combined, we're able to construct these how often, how big curves, frequency magnitude curves, or FM curves. What you see here is all these data that I just illustrated, how we cobble them together, plotted on here with these error bars. As this is not a precise science, but it's an honest thing to do, we say there is an error, but we're still dealing with the best estimate in our predictions. We don't really want to design for the worst credible, because that would mean an over-design and too much money spent. We don't want to under-design and go for the lowermost limit either, because that would not be conservative enough. So then we compared it also with a regional frequency magnitude curve to gather a little bit more confidence in our results. So in short, we really pulled all stops that were practical and within the budget that was given to come up with as defensible as a result as we can. And given that my career isn't over yet, I do want to sleep soundly when it rains a lot, and it will rain a lot in my career in Canmore, I'm sure of that. At Echo Canyon Creek, we could not do test trenching for archaeological reasons, but at X Creek, we were able to. And we had an outstanding excavator operator. We were able to use an existing trail. We did not have to cut down a single tree. And all of our test pits were not only filled back in, but reseeded. And I challenge you to find them now, less than a year later. This test trenching was done for a number of reasons. Number one is the type of material and how it sits tells us what process has created it. It's sort of like opening a book and reading what has happened, a history book, and reading what has happened. It also allows us to take these little bits and pieces of organic material that we find in there, send it to a laboratory in Miami, and a few weeks later we get a letter saying thank you, and this is how old it is. To this day, I always hope they're not making it up, but I do believe their results, and it's not entirely cheap. It's like $600 per sample. Then with these test trenches that are shown here in these locations, we couldn't riddle the entire fan as we did with Cougar Creek, simply for the fact that we did not want to build roads and cut down trees in this area, but do what is reasonable. But we were able to then connect the dots and figure out just where debris flows have traveled well beyond the record that we could establish through air photo analysis or tree ring analysis. So here we're talking thousands of years. Trees may give us a couple hundred years of records. Air photo analysis, 70 years of record. But given that we had committed to looking at up to 1,000 to 3,000 year return periods, we couldn't skip that step. We needed to do that. So I'll go right to the results for the XYZ creeks. Again, this is the how often, how big curve. Here we have the return periods on the x-axis for our 3 creeks. And here we have the volume of debris that would be transported for the respective return periods. And I've lined them up so that you can compare them directly. X Creek, as you can see, goes well up. It's in the tens of thousands of cubic meters for these high return period events. And the main reason is, as you remember from the first slides, it's a bigger watershed. It's got more sediment. It receives more water. So this is very much expected. Y Creek less so, and then Z Creek even a little less, practically and largely a function of watershed area. So you may ask the question, well, why aren't these lines straight? Why are they curving over and eventually going pretty much parallel to these lines? Well, that would be a good question, and it is because there isn't an infinite amount of sediment in these watersheds, particularly Z and Y creeks, much like Stone Creek. Once you have a big debris flow, it licks the watershed clean, and you cannot, even if you had the same very storm the day after, you would not see a debris flow or hardly any debris movement because it's been depleted of material. That is the reason for this specific shape. Once again, we added, that was a strong input from our reviewers, Professor Church and Professor Morgenstern, these error bars to be simply honest about how confident we can be in our predictions. And these shaded areas is really what we consider is our best guess. Estimate. It's not quite a guess. All right, so we have now done a characterization of the watershed. We've done this important frequency magnitude analysis. Now we want to model debris flows, and we can't do that for real because we destroy people's houses, so we have to do it on the computer. Fortunately, there is a whole gamut of tools to do that. These are called two-dimensional runout analysis. Really what we're trying to do on the computer is to create an equivalent fluid, something that behaves like the real thing. And I'll spare you the nitty-gritty details on how we determined that this is truly an equivalent fluid to the real thing, but this is the outcome. So these 5 panels lead you through from the lowest return period interval that we examined all the way to the highest. And as you expect, as you increase the return period and you increase the volume that's transported and the discharge that delivers this sediment down, the more area is being inundated and the higher are the intensities of the flow. This color coding, this traffic light color coding, is by intensity. The red areas are called intensity 100. So what does that 100 mean? It is pretty much the impact force. So it's the velocity times the flow depth. Anybody who's ever done martial art, if you hit somebody twice as fast, you hit them 4 times as hard. That's an important thing to remember if you ever got to get in a bar fight. So, I hope not. The red areas, and you will quickly discover that they're not developed, those are the ones, these 10 to 100 impact intensity, where you could expect a house to be destroyed. When you then get into the orange zone, you could expect some structural damage. But when you get into the yellow zone, we're talking about nuisance damage. So when you look at these maps and you look at the development here delineated in black, you will quickly see that they are largely, and for most return periods, in either the yellow or the orange. So we would not expect houses to be destroyed. So I'll just rattle through the different creeks. Here is Y Creek with the development again. So Y Creek, the flow would be somewhat more confined than at X Creek. Again, the high intensities are close to the undeveloped proximal part of the fan, then the mid-zone orange, and the orange zone, only for the highest return period, extends into the built environment. But once again, orange doesn't mean building destruction. It means some structural damage, but not, the building doesn't have to be rebuilt. And then Z Creek, same idea again, from the 10 to 30 year return period all the way to the maximum event that we considered. Here again, we get into the orange zone, nothing in the red zone, and nothing in the dark red zone, which would be confined really to the very apex of the fan. At Z Creek, it reaches a bit further into the development simply because the distance between the uppermost development to the fan apex is shorter than at any of the other creeks. At Echo Canyon, same idea. Don't have to repeat myself. Echo Canyon Creek, of course, is a different beast because there's no permanent housing, no permanent residences on the fan. So then we create these composite hazard maps. So we take all of these runs together, overlap them with all of these avulsion scenarios that we concoct to make sure that we have it as realistic as possible, and we put that on one single map. We added, just for completeness here, also Stone Canyon Creek, which was studied a few years back as part of the Hillcroft development. Not part of this study, and it was studied at a somewhat different level of detail, but still comparable. So this now gives you a pretty good idea as to the entire hazard distribution for this entire mountain front, including the development. Now, once again, when you look here at the yellow zone, so this includes all the way up to the 3,000 year return period, this is largely water damage. When you go all the way down to here, we're talking about ankle deep water, and we're talking about water velocities that you can walk away from. When you go up to here, we're talking about debris coming at you at maybe 3 or 4 meters height and at full sprinting speed, just to give you an idea. Same thing for Echo Canyon Creek. This is the composite hazard map. So we've now done the characterization, the hazard assessment, including the numerical modeling. So now we have to ask ourselves, if these events were to occur, the whole gamut, the whole spectrum of these events, what would they actually do to the built environment? What would they do in terms of life loss risk, and also to businesses, critical facilities, and lifelines, if existing? When it comes to life loss risk, we differentiate these two critical variables: individual risk and group risk. Individual risk answers the question, if there's a person in the house, and that's typically the person who is spends the most time in the house. That could be a houseman, a housewoman, a elderly person, it could be an infant. That is the person that we're after. We want to know what's the risk to the person most at risk. and it is not proportional to the number of individuals on FM. We also ask, what is the risk to the whole community? So when we look at these big events, who could all be affected? And that's called group risk or societal risk. And it is very much related to the number of people that live on a fan within the impact zone. I'll go right into the results. And this is largely a good news story. Gary Buxton used to call me Dr. Doom. He couldn't today. So here, for all of these returns periods for X Creek, we have less than 1 fatality. And you may frown, what does that mean, less than 1 fatality? Well, because it's statistically determined, that's its artifact. I mean, the average German woman has 0.8 kids. It's not that Germans can't manage to produce a 100% kid, it's just a statistical thing. They got to get more fertile, those Germans. Then here, only for the highest return period class do we actually get fatalities on X Creek. We can look at the other ones too, and the story is largely the same. Less than 1 for all return periods on Z Creek, and only 1 potential fatality for this extreme event on Y Creek. That is fundamentally different to, say, Cougar Creek, where we identified 180 parcels in which that life loss criterion was exceeded. So just to put that into context, to a completely different kind of risk profile. The group risk, so this is individual, the group risk falls into this ALARB zone, which stands for as low as reasonably practical for X and Y creeks, and within the acceptable zone for Z Creek. So when we look at the economic risk, we are interested in the total economic losses to these buildings for all of these return periods, and then we annualize them. The annualized is a nice figure because it's easily comparable. So at X Creek, we go from $13,000, at Z Creek, $21,000 per year. Again, to contextualize that, at Cougar Creek, we had $600,000 per year. So very, very different, 2 orders of magnitude less. We also looked at the business losses, and the business losses, because there's not real shops or industry in this area, it's really home-based businesses. And there we're talking about up to 4.7 million, but again, for the 1,000 to 3,000 year event.
Just could you detail how the annualized building damage is calculated?
Sure. So we determine the costs for each one of these return periods, and then we aggregate them and divide them by the return periods to come up with an annual loss. It's really a fictitious number because you're not losing 13,000 a year. It's really, if all these events were to occur in their unmitigated state, that would be the loss. And it's really a number for comparison rather than, and for you to make decisions. If that number is very high, then you may, for cost-benefit analysis reasons, say, well, it is quite sensible to mitigate here, but if the annualized damage is so low, then repairing the losses may be more cost efficient than actually spending millions of dollars on mitigation.
For context, I think that number for Cougar Creek was about 600.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember that.
We can also cartographically represent that. So when we look at these life loss risk tolerance criteria that Canmore has adopted, and Canmore is the only community in Canada that has adopted them for individual risk and group risk, so truly having a Canadian leadership role here, which we highly commend. You can see that for individual risk, we've highlighted in green here where the risk is acceptable, in orange where the risk is tolerable, and then in red where the risk is just marginal. So in here, the risk for these 2 homes on Z Creek, it means that it is right at the border between unacceptable and tolerable. This is very, very different again from Cougar Creek, where the map was riddled with reds. At Echo Canyon Creek, we can't do quite the same analysis because we're now talking horses, and horse lovers would possibly argue that we should, but we didn't go that route. So here we simply highlighted areas that would be affected by different return period classes and color-coded the paddocks, if that's the correct plural form, by color and by return period at which they would experience impact. So now I'll turn the presentation over to my colleague, unless you have, well, we can have questions afterwards too. She's been certainly responsible for the mitigation aspects, and she'll talk a little bit about the generalities of the mitigation and then the details of the options that were considered or are considered for XYZ Creek and Echo Canyon Creek. Great.
All right, sounds good. Thanks, Matthias. Maybe just to check in before I get going, do I have a time limit, Andy? Kind of like another 10 minutes or something? Don't have that much more to go. Should be good. How do I work? Are you just clicking?
I will just announce for pointing.
Okay.
We're getting there.
All right. Good call. All right. Hello. So Matthias has provided a recap of the hazard and risk picture on XYZ and Echo Creeks. And as he mentioned, it is quite a good news story compared to Cougar Creek and some of the other creeks. The group risk is either acceptable in the case of Zed Creek and Echo Creek, or in the ALARP zone for Y and X Creek and Y Creek. And then individual risk, it's only Zed Creek that has a few houses that are kind of at this marginal, just at the threshold. So looking at mitigation options, these are really things that could be considered given based on the prioritization with some of the other sites. So in general, mitigation options that can be used to manage steep creek hazards can be divided into two categories: active or engineered measures. So these are structural measures, such as are being applied at Cougar Creek in the form of a debris retention barrier or the debris net that's already existing at Cougar. The other options are passive measures. These are non-structural, non-engineered measures, such as land use, emergency management plans, softer things that can be equally beneficial in reducing risk, but don't require perhaps the same capital cost expenditure or actual structure on the ground standing in the way of the debris or the water. In terms of generally different types of active measures that can be considered to manage steep creek hazards, one is to capture the sediment. Another would be to deflect it, so to send it to a different part of the fan or away from elements at risk. And another option would be improved conveyance, so passing the sediment or the flows through the elements at risk. So that's kind of what's done at Cougar with the armored channel in that case. So looking at the creeks that we were studying as part of this work, first at X Creek, the story at X Creek is really that the hazard or the risk on X Creek is quite low if the flows stay in the existing channel. The existing channel is shown in blue and kind of flows towards that eastern portion of the fan in that right-hand green polygon. And if the flows stay in that area, that area is undeveloped, there's no elements at risk, so there's no concern. The issues come up if the flows evolve, so pick a different flow path. And we identified a couple locations where that could occur, which are marked by stars on this map. So a mitigation option that could be considered at X Creek, and the one that kind of in our assessment perhaps came out as most favorable, would be monitoring and channel works. So maybe on an annual basis or after every large event, going up to these avulsion points and assessing whether there's still sufficient capacity in this channel to keep sending the flows away from the houses. And if that is not the case and we see sediment starting to aggrade in those areas, there would be an opportunity to do local channel works and maintain that channel. Other measures that could also be considered, this monitoring and channel works program could be could be paired with a hazard awareness and education program for the residents, which is really being started tonight with the public meeting that's going to be held, to make residents aware of this potential threat coming from the steep creeks in their area. And this is just things like, given that the flow intensities in this area are quite low, again, compared to Cougar, we're talking about flows maybe half a meter deep, moving at 1 to 2 meters per second. The vulnerability of people impacted by these flows is only 1 to 2%. So even if a flow is reaching a house, the person needs to be maybe quite unlucky or in a poor location and within that house for a fatality to occur. So if we can educate people about not being in basements, not being on ground floors, when there is a risk of these flows coming down, there's quite a lot of opportunity there to reduce the risk through passive measures. And other options to be considered on X Creek are land use zoning, so ensuring that eastern portion of the fan where the flows are heading right now, there isn't large development put in place there. Our understanding is there's no plans to develop in that area at the moment, and maintaining that space for the creek to move naturally. All right. Moving on to Y Creek. In this case, the majority, I believe that the properties most at risk on Y Creek are these ones here. So the main flow path is coming down this area. And it's these houses here, which are also the houses that were quite close to the flows, or where there was flow between these houses in 2012. The wall was constructed, and the flows actually passed just upstream of these houses in 2013. So an option in Y Creek, in 2013, the wall that was constructed came to within kind of 20, 30 centimeters of being overtopped by floodwater moving on the upstream side of that wall. So putting in a little bit of effort to potentially raise the height of that wall could reduce the risk in that area if the decision is made that it is worthwhile to put in place structural measures on Y Creek. Again, risk is tolerable from an individual risk perspective, so maybe not strictly necessary. And then again, hazard awareness education is potential. Actually, this is just a sketch showing the green is the portion of existing wall that could be, the height could be increased or potentially the wall reinforced to increase its capacity. Our modeling showed that wall could be overtopped beyond about 100-year return period debris flows. Or additional walls could be constructed upstream to start attenuating and diverting the flows. On Z Creek, this is the only case of our study creeks where we did have specific houses where individual risk was effectively at the threshold, the tolerable risk threshold. And so in this case, there are also several options that could be considered, including hazard awareness education again. In this case again, so this is just zooming in on those left-hand houses in the orange zone. There are existing wooden walls already in place as well, shown in brown, but they are a little bit shorter than what our modeling actually showed could occur. So the orange zone there is the higher flow intensity debris extent from the 100 to 300 year event. And so our modeling is showing that if those wooden walls were extended just a little bit, there'd be an opportunity to catch those flows and divert them around the developed area. Additional options that could be considered, but that do come with a much higher price tag, but kind of throwing everything out there at this point for consideration, would be to construct debris retention structures further upstream near the fan apex, and that could consist of a flexible net again, an option that's familiar from Cougar Creek, or some kind of earth fill or concrete debris retention structure, the upstream end. The advantage of a structure further downstream as compared to the upstream is that the impact forces encountered in this upstream area are much higher, so the level of engineering and design is much, much higher. There's a good opportunity here that the development is so far downstream on X, Y, and Z creeks, in that from a mitigation perspective, we don't need to interact with it until it's already calmed down a little bit. And looking at Echo Canyon Creek, as Matthias mentioned, this is a different situation because nobody is actually living at site. We do understand that there's quite a heavy presence at times from recreational users at the Bow Valley Riding Association, but there's an opportunity to kind of manage that presence on the site through evacuation and limited access in times of high flows on the creek. And again, hazard awareness education for people who might be in that area. And our understanding is there's already an emergency response plan in place that the town has in place to manage some of these hazards at Echo Canyon Creek. All right, so I'll keep going. So in conclusion, our study shows that all 4 creeks are subject to debris floods at lower return periods and potentially debris flows at higher return periods. So debris flows are those bonier, coarser ones that Matthias showed us. And they are subject to debris flows because of their smaller watershed sizes. Frequency magnitude relationships were developed for all 3 of the creeks based on a variety of different analysis methods. And we found that at the kind of upper end of the range we were looking at, so the 1,000 to 3,000 year event for each creek, we found that the X Creek sediment, I don't know if I need to go through these numbers per se, but X Creek could involve up to about 30,000 cubic meters of sediment with peak discharge at 440 cubic meters per second. And you can see Echo Canyon, similar expected sediment volume and peak discharge because they have similar watershed sizes. And then Y and Z creeks have substantially smaller sediment volumes and peak discharges, much smaller watersheds, so just less space to produce those flows.
Just 1 second,
sure.
Please. Councillor Comfort, you had a question?
Yeah, I don't know if this is the right place to ask this question, but it occurred to me, I wonder how long it takes to, for example, factors like knowing how long it takes to evacuate an area. Wouldn't that affect the rate of fatalities?
Definitely.
And
yeah.
So is there a formula that you employ to come up with that kind of in the risk assessment?
That's a very good question. So our risk assessment methods are assuming that no evacuation has occurred and that all of the residents in that area are within buildings. Okay. So it's kind of a balance. No one's evacuated from the area, but at least I'm not standing in my backyard as the debris flow comes at me, kind of thing. And certainly, if evacuation measures are in place to bring people out of an area, there's the potential to significantly decrease risk.
Because I was thinking, this is not like an earthquake, say, where it's like that and there's no warning. There would be a warning period where you would know it was raining, for instance, and how long the rain was forecast to go on, and then people would be comparing it to the Great Flood of 2013. You know, and so I'm curious about that, how those factors are taken into account when you come up with risk.
Definitely.
For Cougar Creek, just in comparison, we did actually do that. So we had a case study to compare by. We knew that the town evacuated people alongside the fringe of Cougar Creek. So in our model, we allowed for a certain percentage, in our risk model, a certain percentage of people to be evacuated in the case of Cougar Creek. What we do not have, so the town of Kenmore keeps a very close eye on weather development, and I think an emergency plan is being worked on in terms of they're in place, even better. So that is a factor. However, with these debris flows, because they react quite different to than the debris floods, it's very hard to predict when and if they occur. Particularly if you think about how the weather evolved for the 2013 event, that was, yes, there was issues with its prediction, and particularly the flood warning, but these days one can see how the weather system forms, and you would have ample warning to know when it comes and how much rain there would be dumped in this event. With these XYZ creeks, you could have a beautiful summer day, but an unstable air mass, and you get a big cumulus nimbus cloud developing, parks itself right over XYZ, that doesn't show up on a weather front map that slowly comes in. It would only be detectable on a weather radar. and all of a sudden it gushes for 2 hours. And that's it. There's your debris flow.
Okay. Thank you. That's very helpful.
Any other questions at this point?
No, this time, do you have more to speak to?
There's a couple more slides, just
Great.
recapping from a
Sure.
conclusion point, but okay. So to summarize, yeah, life loss risks on all the studied creeks are either tolerable or, in the case of Zed Creek, very near to tolerable. The risk assessment identified that individual risk at Zed Creek is right at that tolerable, intolerable threshold according to the targets adopted by Canmore. But the group risk is acceptable. And then on X and Y Creek, individual risk is tolerable, but group risk is in the ALARP zone of that frequency and fatality plot. Expected annualized economic damages are significantly lower than have been estimated for some of the other major creeks in the area. And then at Echo Canyon Creek, there is the potential for individual risk to exceed the 1 in 10,000 threshold at some portions of the facility if individuals are present kind of right in the paddocks near the creek. But there's the opportunity to evacuate in advance. And then from a risk reduction perspective, mitigation is not mandated. The homeowner education program in the area around X, Y, and Z creeks in the Peaks of Grassy neighborhood would certainly be beneficial and is already being initiated with this meeting tonight. On X Creek, with the avulsion potential, could be managed through monitoring and channel works. Y Creek could be managed through increasing the height of that wall. Z Creek, extending the already existing wall. And then an Echo, an emergency management plan. I think that's all we have. I believe there were a couple questions.
Thanks very much. Councillor Sanford, you have a question.
I have a question. Thank you for your presentation. I was part of the conversation in 2012 when we added those sections on the walls, and fortuitously they did have the impact in 2013 to divert some of that. Do we have to maintain those walls somehow and clean the debris from behind the walls after an event?
That is a good question. It depends a lot on the type of event that actually reaches that distal portion of the fan. So in the case of the 2013 event, there was a debris flow that occurred on the upper portions of Y Creek. So big piles of rocks are up there if you ever go hiking around. But the flow that actually made it to the distal fan, so down to the area against the walls, was mostly behaving as a debris flood at that point. So mostly water, a little bit of sediment. I expect that maybe some cleanup work was done following that kind of flow to make sure that the riprap upstream of the walls is still in place and the walls are still in shape. But there shouldn't have been too much debris cleanout required from that particular event. But it would be, there is the potential maintenance would be required after.
Did you examine those walls in some of your
research?
We did.
Yes,
Okay.
And they look to be in quite good shape.
Great.
Yeah.
That's good to know because they did make a difference.
Definitely. Yeah.
I had a question for you about the other study that you did on Stone Canyon Creek, which intersects with the Zed Creek, which is now becoming part of a development proposal. So if you're going to mitigate two separate creek events or steep creek events, what would you do? Like you'd have to do something that would be compatible with both debris flows?
Do you want to field that one?
Sure.
All right.
Yeah, so at the time when we did the study for the development
Nope.
oh, certainly. I thought Germans are so loud they can hear them from everywhere. But at the time when we did the study for Hillcroft Developer, we did propose a deflection berm at this location, just about through here, that would prevent the muddy overland flows to reach the development, which is an infill in this area here. So first of all, there would be no impact from either X Creek or Y Creek to the proposed development, solely for Z Creek. For Z Creek, by the time the flow reaches this area, it could not be classified a debris flow anymore, not even a debris flood, really. We're talking ankle-deep water at walking speed. And that water would be managed by Canmore's engineering guidelines of surface water flow. So there would be grading restrictions, and Andy can talk to that as to how the building would be constructed. But it is definitely not a life loss risk.
So does your study on Zed Creek change anything for the mitigation that was proposed prior?
No, there would be no recommendations we would make to physical mitigation for this proposed development with this study in mind, other than surface water works that would be done anyway as part of the development.
Can I ask one more question? In the past, we talked about developing an early warning system based on measures of weather and temperature and rainfall. Is that in place now, or is that functional?
I'll deflect that question to Andy or to Felix.
Because I believe it was something that we had funded, so.
No, well, that's a little bit the same question as earlier when I was presenting, I think. So the early warning system is part of the trying to figure out what's going to happen and what the timing. So that's where weather station ties in and things like that. But we don't have a complete system right now in place.
I can add just one more sentence to that. We did approach Alberta Environment with the proposal of creating such system, not just for Canmore, but for the whole Bow Valley. Because in our work now, we've learned we could create an online tool that would not only say which creeks are susceptible to which process if that storm were to occur, but we could even predict how much sediment would be moved, which would allow then to put an excavator here and emergency there. So far, they haven't been susceptible to taking that idea a step further, but the tools would be there. So if you have any clout in encouraging the government to go that route, that would be formidable.
Just something else on this too, part of the XYZ and Stone Echo Canyon study, there was a staff member from AEP, the river forecasting team, that actually was not really overseeing it, but like trying to understand better how these studies are being done and understand better the debris flow, debris flood concepts. It's part of one thing is they don't have a lot of expertise in their team right now, so they're definitely unsure about taking that over, taking like such a early warning system over from, on their branch right now because of the lack of experience and expertise in their team. So, but they're trying to develop that a little bit with their involvement in this project.
So the data you're collecting right now, that's what you're using it for, sort of to put together an idea of what's happening, or how you can predict things that are happening?
No, well, no, exactly. So like we can actually look back, obviously, and we know right now we know a lot better what's happening in real life. So, for example, the June event that we had this year, June 25th, I think it was, we actually knew how much water was actually falling into the watershed, Cougar Creek watershed. So that was helping us understand better how much would actually come out. But it wasn't part of the early warning per se. The early warning was more the forecast and how much rain, not rain, but snow is still left in the watershed, for example, right? But we don't have the full system tied in together at this point.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Seeley.
Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you for your presentation and your contributions to Canmore. I find this work fascinating.
Our pleasure.
What we know now, Cougar Creek, we probably would have made different decisions if we had the information that we have. And when I look at X, Y, and Z creeks, you already answered Councillor Sanford's question in regards to that seems to be the most concerning up there. But the overall development seems to line up as being safe. There's nothing to really be concerned about with the information that you provided. Do I have that right?
Yeah, with nuances. So, I mean, We are unfortunately in the business of sort of thinking the incredible. If you were in a basement or on the ground level in one of the buildings that are on the upslope side, in the really wrong moment, and for example in the basement, if the debris flow were to crush through the windows and the sediment would block the door for an exit, and then water rushes in, there is still the potential of life loss in one of these extreme events. So I could never ascertain that that could not happen. But in comparison to many of the other creeks, either in Canmore or the MD Bighorn, the risk profile overall is way lower.
Thank you.
So on the page 100 of the XYZ report and the conclusions, it's 7.2.3, risk reduction, you know, mitigation is not a necessity, but rather a beneficial measure if life loss were considered the only criterion. And then below that, point 4, you note that on Zed Creek, the risks also arise from the main flow path, and the existing wooden wall could be extended to redirect flows through an expanded channel, which is what you've been speaking to. And I understand that as a fairly simple piece of work. Would you propose to see the walls made taller or just longer, or what's the expectation?
In true form, the geoscientist deflects the engineer.
I believe just extending the wall in that case would be sufficient. I haven't done a detailed engineering assessment of exactly how that wall was constructed, but mostly what our model was showing is that the existing wall is slightly bypassed by the flows. So our model wasn't assessing whether that wall could take those impact forces. I defer to the town's engineers or the group that designed the wall to check that out, but extending that wall slightly should be enough rather than necessarily needing to increase the height on Zed Creek.
Okay, thank you. And you also note in your report that a good recommendation is to assess any changes if there should be a debris flow, to physically go up and have a look at that.
Yeah, all of the hazard maps that we've produced over the last 5 years have that caveat that should there be either a sizable event or any artificial alterations of the terrain through whatever means, then one has to revisit the hazards. As soon as the topography changes, it's worth a review. That could just be by somebody walking and seeing, has anything happened substantially, saying, nope, we're done. To, yes, it has changed dramatically, we ought to redo the numerical modeling with the new topography in order to account for those changes and see if that has changed the risk profile to an extent whereby additional mitigation may be warranted. But we're not talking about a pile of debris, we're talking about a substantial event that would trigger that process.
Great. Okay, are there any other questions from members of council? Seeing none, thanks very much for being here today and giving that comprehensive report. It's been some time since we've seen that level of detail, and certainly been looking forward to getting the report on Echo Canyon Creek and the XYZ. And really appreciate the continued involvement of BGC with the work we're doing here in the town of Canmore, and highly regard the work that you're doing, and as I know our other partners in the valley and the province as well. So thanks for being here, and we'll look forward to continuing to work with you.
Thanks very much for the questions and having us here. We're not going to leave quite yet. We're still working for some developers, hopefully in close collaboration with your engineers and council to make this a smooth ride. So we're not quite saying goodbye yet. So thanks again for having us.
Thanks very much. Okay, with that, we'll move into item E1, Councillor Updates. And follow this usual format. If there's any questions from any member of council for any other member of council, now's the time to ask them. I did want to add one additional verbal update to myself or to my own work. Last Friday, it was too late to include it in the written report, but on Friday last week, I attended the inauguration of the new Wesley Band Chief and Council, Chief Clifford Poussette, and the councillors were Shane Crawler, Krista Hunter, Hank Snow, and Rufus, 2 young men. So that was a really great opportunity to engage with the Stoney Nakoda in that way. Continuing to build our relations with First Nations and have that relationship reflected in their reaching out to the town of Canmore and be involved in those sorts of activities. So that was an interesting day. In regards to other reports, are there any questions? Just one note, in some of the reports, initials are used, and for people, like JH and NR will develop educational components. That's in the urban elk monitoring, and it leaves us to guess who is being referred to. Just for future reference, it's nice to have the full name. If there's no questions at this time from members of council. Councillor McCallum.
I just wanted to provide some context. I realized that in my report, I didn't really finish a sentence. And I went back last night to see what it was I was trying to say, and it was a big fat nothing. Okay. I had just started the sentence over again, so I typo, my apologies.
Okay. We'll move on to agenda item F1 then, service area reports. And we'll go through section by section as we always do. A lot of the questions, I guess we won't have answers today since half of senior admin is not here. I know, Mr. Fark's there. The under municipal services, recreation notes the current total membership of Elevation Place at 2744. I guess it's easy or it's safe to assume that's as of the end of December 2018. Okay. Seems like a logical guess. A similar question under finance, notes in December 1,665 business licenses were invoiced. Does anybody know how that compares to past years? Okay. Maybe we'll get that detail supplied later. In the report on under Public Works, Parks, it refers to the new ice rink at Hawks Bend should be open by early in the new year. Is it open and functioning now, do you know?
Yes. It is now opening and functioning, yes.
Great.
The weather was not terribly cooperative, but we've gotten there finally.
Excellent. Any questions from councillors in the service area report? Seeing none, moving on to the council resolution action list, which is getting shorter. That's good to see. I don't have any questions specific to that report. Anybody else? Seeing none. At this point, I'll move that Committee of the Whole goes in camera to discuss the Calgary Bow Valley Mass Transit Feasibility Study. And that's in camera to prevent premature disclosure of information that will be released to the public within 60 days in accordance with Section 29(1)B of the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. So I'll move council go in camera. Those in favor, opposed, motion's carried unanimously. We're in camera.
Alhamdulillah.